When Dimitri I came to the Georgian throne in 1125 at the age of 28, his position was far from secure. His father had died without formally presenting him to the leading clergy and nobles as successor, and one interpretation of the royal testament even suggested that Dimitri was meant only to serve as regent for his younger brother. Although the great conquests of his father, David IV, had created a united and well-fortified kingdom, they also left Georgia facing powerful Muslim neighbours along a vast frontier stretching from the Black Sea across Armenia and Azerbaijan to the Caspian Sea. This immense defensive line placed enormous pressure on Georgia's forces, despite their mobility and experience. Dimitri inherited symbols of royal authority and great wealth, yet his rivals moved quickly, attacking before he could fully secure his rule. Almost immediately, he was drawn into conflict with the Seljuks over the fortress of Dimitri, a strategic stronghold guarding the southern approaches to Tibilisi. Though the fortress would change hands repeatedly in the following years, Dimitri managed to expand his influence by capturing Kunani, strengthening the defensive barrier formed by the mountains of Trialeti. At the same time, unrest broke out in Shirvan, ruled by Dimitri's brother-in-law. The local population, supported by the Seljuks, sought to restore an independent Muslim emirate. Rather than pursue a destructive war, Dimitri negotiated a settlement. Shirvan was divided along the Tetri-Skali River. The northwestern region, where Christianity had greater influence, was incorporated into Georgia, while the eastern portion remained under its ruler, who retained limited independence but was obliged to pay tribute and supply troops during wartime. This arrangement ultimately benefited Shirvan as well, since Georgian protection shielded it from hostile neighbours. Dimitri strengthened his position further through diplomacy and marriage alliances. His daughter was married to the ruler of Derbent, ensuring that the region became a loyal, though loosely controlled, vassal. Throughout his reign, Georgia maintained a policy of religious tolerance. The king visited mosques, employed Muslim scholars at court, minted coins bearing Arabic inscriptions, and granted tax privileges to the Muslim population of Tibilisi. These measures helped stabilize relations within the diverse kingdom and promoted coexistence among different religious communities. One of Dimitri's most persistent challenges was control over the Armenian city of Ani. While many Armenian Christians welcomed liberation from Muslim rule, local nobles often feared losing their autonomy and sometimes preferred Muslim overlordship, if it preserved their privileges. Political tensions soon forced Dimitri to release a Muslim governor who had previously been imprisoned. Shortly afterward, the governor's son returned from exile and regained authority in Ani, apparently with the cooperation of local leaders who sought security and stability. Some Georgian officials suspected betrayal, and later events suggested that certain nobles were plotting against the king. In the following years, powerful Muslim rulers launched repeated campaigns to push Georgian forces out of Armenia. At the same time, ambitious regional leaders expanded their own territories, capturing key cities such as Devin and Ganja. Dimitri eventually reached a fragile compromise with one of these rulers, allowing the Cathedral of Ani to remain a Christian sanctuary while acknowledging the new political realities. This uneasy balance continued for decades, with Ani remaining a contested frontier between competing powers. Internal tensions soon erupted into conspiracy. A prominent noble discovered that his own son had joined a plot involving a young pretender who aimed to overthrow Dimitri. The conspirators were arrested and tried. The father was acquitted, but his son was secretly executed after receiving a military appointment. The young claimant was blinded, a punishment that led to his death soon afterward. These harsh measures demonstrated the king's determination to eliminate threats to his authority. External dangers continued to multiply. A new and powerful state emerged to Georgia's south under a ruler who established control over large territories in Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran. Georgia might have faced a devastating invasion had a catastrophic earthquake not struck the region, destroying the city of Ganja and causing immense loss of life. Seizing this opportunity, Dimitri invaded the devastated territory, removing the city's iron gates and transporting them to a Georgian monastery as a symbol of victory. Yet triumph brought new conflicts. Muslim forces later attempted to reclaim lost territory, and although Dimitri achieved military success, he secured peace through diplomatic marriage, giving his daughter in marriage to a Seljuk ruler, along with valuable lands as part of her dowry. Other marital alliances proved less effective in strengthening Georgia's international position, but his daughters nonetheless played significant roles in regional politics. During the later years of his reign, tensions grew within the royal family. The king quarrelled with his elder son and chose his younger son as heir, a decision that angered many nobles. Dissatisfaction spread quietly among the aristocracy until open rebellion finally erupted. Dimitri was forced to renounce the throne temporarily and take monastic vows while his elder son assumed power. However, the new ruler's reign lasted only a few months before he died suddenly under suspicious circumstances. Dimitri returned briefly to political life, but eventually retired permanently to a monastery, devoting himself to religious reflection and composing hymns. After his withdrawal from public life, little was recorded about his final years. His successor, Giorgi III, ascended the throne amid uncertainty and opposition from powerful aristocratic factions. Though married to a princess of remarkable beauty, he lacked a male heir, which further weakened his position and encouraged rivals to support alternative claimants. He responded swiftly by suppressing supporters of his predecessors and strengthening royal authority. Military campaigns became central to his rule, as he sought both security and prestige through warfare. Giorgi pursued aggressive policies against neighbouring states, demanding tribute and launching campaigns into contested regions. His reign was marked by repeated struggles over Ani and other strategic cities, as well as fierce battles against Muslim coalitions. At times, he suffered setbacks, but he also achieved notable victories that enhanced his reputation. His armies defeated larger forces, liberated prisoners, and rebuilt devastated cities. Georgian influence expanded across parts of Armenia and Azerbaijan, while vassal states such as Shirvan remained under his protection. Despite these successes, the continuous warfare drained Georgia's resources and manpower. Economic pressures increased, and new taxes were imposed even on church lands, risking conflict with powerful religious institutions. Nevertheless, military glory elevated Giorgi's standing, and poets of the era celebrated him as a heroic defender of the faith and a ruler of extraordinary strength. During the later part of his reign, foreign conflicts decreased, but internal tensions intensified. Georgian commanders, unwilling to remain idle, drove nomadic groups from contested territories, while the king introduced severe measures to maintain order within the kingdom. Laws against theft and banditry became stricter, replacing traditional compensation payments with harsh punishments. A specialized force was established to pursue criminals, and severe penalties, including public execution, were imposed to restore stability. A major rebellion eventually erupted when a powerful noble sought to placing a rival claimant on the throne. The conspirators gathered a large force and attempted to capture the king, but their plans were discovered at the last moment. Loyal troops rallied to defend the monarchy, and after a prolonged siege, the rebels were defeated. the punishment was severe. The claimant was mutilated and died from the ordeal. Leading conspirators were executed or exiled, and their family name was officially condemned. Their lands and offices were redistributed to loyal supporters, including individuals of humble origin who were elevated to high positions. Having secured his authority, Giorgi sought to ensure a stable succession. Lacking a son, he made the unprecedented decision to crown his daughter Tamar as co-ruler, presenting her before the assembled clergy and nobility in a formal ceremony that confirmed her right to inherit the throne. This act provided a clear line of succession and brought a measure of political stability after decades of uncertainty. The years immediately following Tamar's first coronation beside her father were quiet on the surface, and the surviving records say little about day-to-day politics. Yet the early 1180s were anything but empty in cultural terms. Georgia's court was confident, outward-looking, and deeply attuned to Persianate taste and courtly ideals. And in that atmosphere, the era's greatest literary achievements were likely taking shape. The celebrated epic, commonly associated with Georgia's Golden Age, opens with an image that mirrors the political reality of the time. A ruler confidently placing authority into the hands of a daughter, insisting that courage and worth do not depend on being male. That tone of assurance and the emphasis on refined chivalric values matches the moment when a woman was being prepared to rule in her own name. Giorgi III died in Kakheti on Easter Saturday in 1184, and even the way the news travelled revealed the tensions around the throne. The message was carried first to Rusudan at Samshvilde, and only afterward reached Tamar in Tibilisi. Before the mourning cloth had even come down, the king's death triggered a confrontation between a resentful aristocracy and a young monarch who was now the first Georgian queen to rule without a male partner standing above her. The opening demand from the church and the nobles sounded reasonable and even traditional. Tamar should undergo a second anointing, this time in Kutaisi, and accept crown, scepter, and sword through a ceremony that placed leading clerics and Western magnates at the centre of the ritual. Georgia had seen double ceremonies before, and precedent could be invoked without difficulty. Tamar agreed, but the larger meaning was clear. A second coronation was not only about religious blessing. It was an attempt to bind the new monarch to the will of the elite and to remind the court that power was not simply inherited, but negotiated. The aristocracy moved quickly from symbolism to administration. They demanded that Tamar reverse the social reshaping carried out under her father, especially the promotion of men of humble background and outsiders who had risen through talent and loyalty rather than birth. Tamar yielded. A former serf who had gained a major post and estates was stripped of both office and land. A steppe commander, already weakened by illness, was removed from key responsibilities, though permitted to keep his fief. With two great offices now vacant, the nobles pressed harder. They proposed a new political structure beside the royal residence at Isani, a tent of lords that would control the appointment of ministers and the making of laws, leaving the crown to approve decisions as a mere formality. It was a bid to convert influence into constitutional power, aimed at a ruler they assumed could be bent. At the heart of that movement stood Kutlu Arslan, the royal treasurer. His name sounded Turkic, but he was rooted in a powerful Western lineage and led a faction that presented itself as fully Georgian in character. He was not seeking a dramatic charter wrested from tyranny, nor building a broad platform for common rights. The struggle was narrower and more practical. Senior nobles wanted to secure authority at the top of government, while the monarchy was led by a young queen. Kutlu Arslan himself appears to have aimed at the highest military office, and the rhetoric around the crisis reflected anxieties about a woman ruling without firm guidance. Tamar's own chronicler later condemned the rebellion as following foreign patterns of governance, implying that lords were urging her to rule through ministers in the style of Eastern courts, rather than to act decisively as earlier Georgian monarchs had done. Tamar chose a direct response. Kutlu Arslan was arrested. The rebels threatened violence, expecting the queen to retreat. Instead, she used time and persuasion as weapons. 2 high-ranking women were dispatched to negotiate, drawing the faction into prolonged talks, while Tamar prepared loyal forces in the background. An offer was made: pardon for those who submitted. With Kutlu Arslan excluded, the rebels could not unite around a clear answer, and their cohesion broke. They surrendered. What was conceded behind the scenes remains difficult to pin down, but the visible outcome favoured the crown. No permanent House of Lords appeared. Kutlu Arslan was eventually forgiven but withdrew from public life, and the queen continued to treat the existing royal council as her predecessors had, not as a body that could command her. Even after that victory, Tamar still faced an entrenched obstacle inside the church itself. The Catholicos Patriarch, Michael Miryanisce, was elderly and extraordinarily powerful. He had advanced by pushing aside respected rivals, and by accumulating posts that made him both spiritual head and the kingdom's leading minister. A former patriarch, Nikolaos Gouloberisce, had departed the country on royal business, working to strengthen Georgian monastic interests abroad and to protect Georgian monks and pilgrims from harassment and taxation. Michael's rise had also displaced a widely admired figure, Anton Glonistavistze, who was forced into monastic retirement. The political temperature rose further when violence struck Anton's family, adding fear to resentment within the elite and the clergy. In 1185, Tamar attempted a move that echoed the strategies of earlier strong rulers. She summoned a major synod, hoping to silence opposition and curtail patriarchal dominance through collective clerical authority. Michael was excluded from the gathering. Nikolaos was recalled from Jerusalem to steer the proceedings, and the Bishop of Kutaisi, no admirer of the patriarch, supported the effort. Tamar herself opened the discussions, a symbolic act meant to show that the crown could guide the church's internal order. But the synod would not cross the decisive line. It declared that it had no right to depose the patriarch, and it refused to remove the kingdom's chief minister. Michael kept his offices. Tamar's only success was partial. She replaced some hostile bishops with supporters, strengthening her position gradually rather than through a single dramatic purge. The most personal struggle soon became the most political. The court and the church insisted that the queen must marry quickly, not for romance, but for stability. An heir was needed, and an alliance with a major Christian power could secure Georgia's position. Byzantium, weakened and increasingly unstable, no longer looked like a reliable anchor. The obvious choice was Kievan Rus, the greatest Orthodox power within reach. The royal council argued, searched, and eventually selected a prince with a strong military reputation. Yuri Andreevich, known for fighting his own rivals in the complex politics of the Rus lands. After his father's death, he had been driven from his position and ended up among the Chipchaks, steppe forces who raided the northern frontier regions. The match was politically attractive, but for Tamar it was deeply unwelcome. She did not want a rushed marriage to a stranger. Pressure overcame hesitation. Rusudan, the patriarch, and influential courtiers moved fast, using contacts with the Chipchak leaders to bring the groom across the Caucasus. A prominent merchant from Tibilisi played a key role in the embassy, and the speed of the arrangement suggested that urban economic interests favoured a Russian connection. Yuri arrived, and the wedding followed almost immediately. He was declared king in title, yet Tamar retained supreme authority, presented not as his subordinate, but as the ruling monarch. On paper, it looked like a partnership. In practice, it was a political compromise designed to reassure those who doubted a woman's capacity to hold the throne alone. Yuri quickly demonstrated military skill, the quality most expected of a male consort. Campaigns were launched into Armenia, fortified cities were threatened, and raiding expeditions struck deep into Seljuk lands, returning with considerable booty. His name and authority were publicly displayed through coinage and inscriptions, and in some sources he appeared under a Georgian royal name that cast him as a conqueror. At court, victories were celebrated in the language of triumph, and the royal couple travelled widely, visiting vassal rulers and religious centres. Tamar's reign was marked by movement and presence. She showed herself across her domains, among princes, relatives, monks, and city elites, reinforcing loyalty through visibility as well as through policy. Yet the marriage's political promise proved hollow. There is little sign that Georgia gained the strong alliance with Rus that had been promised, and the private relationship deteriorated sharply. In court memory, Yuri's behaviour became a scandal. Stories circulated of drunkenness, humiliation, and sexual misconduct. The chronicler framed him as morally corrupt and personally dangerous, and while the language reflects hostility and the need to justify a divorce, it is clear that the union became unbearable at the centre of power. Monks were sent to admonish him, but nothing changed. By 1188, Tamar decided that the marriage had to end. She asked the council and bishops for annulment. They granted it. Yuri was expelled, compensated with valuables, and sent away by ship to Constantinople. That same year removed another barrier. Mikhail Mirianidze died, and later writers recorded the event without grief. With the patriarch gone, Tamar gained room to breathe. A respected former minister was released from monastic confinement. A new patriarch, though related to Mikhail, proved more compliant. Tamar began building her own governing team, promoting men whose loyalty had been tested under her father and who could balance noble factions. Sargis Mkargodzeli rose to command. His sons, Zachariah and Ivane, became central figures in Tamar's military and political machine. Another trusted court figure moved into the interior ministry. Some of these men were not of purely Georgian origin, and their family background would later become a point of controversy, especially in religious matters. For the moment, their competence outweighed prejudice. Tamar needed administrators and commanders who could defend the realm while she reasserted the crown's authority at home. With independence regained, Tamar was free to remarry on her own terms. The court's attention turned to David Soslan, young Ossetian prince raised within the Georgian environment. Such fostering arrangements were a deliberate policy. Neighbouring royal families exchanged sons, building bonds that could restrain conflict and create loyalty. Soslan had strong dynastic connections through marriage lines that linked Ossetian royalty and the Bagratid house, and he was close enough in blood and culture that he could be presented as an acceptable consort, without provoking fears of a foreign takeover. Strategically, Ossetia offered limited advantage because Tamar already had Ossetian ties through her mother, but Soslan's personal qualities mattered. He was capable in war and suited the court's expectations. The council stopped searching for a more prestigious match and accepted him. They married in 1189. The union proved both fertile and politically useful. An heir was born in 1192, followed by a daughter in 1193. Soslan could also play the harsher role when required. Tamar was known for restraint, reluctant toward torture and execution, and the presence of a consort willing to impose severity created a dual image of justice: mercy at the centre, steel at the edge. That balance would become important as enemies tested Georgia during the years of turmoil that had surrounded her accession. Foreign powers watched closely as Georgian court politics oscillated from crisis to settlement between 1184 and 1189. The wider Muslim world also shifted dramatically when Salah ad-Din captured Jerusalem in 1187, altering the strategic landscape for every Christian kingdom in the region. Tamar's immediate priority was not conquest, but the safety and property of Georgian monastic institutions in the Holy Land. Diplomatic missions were sent to secure privileges for pilgrims, an exemption from taxation for Georgian monasteries, and an agreement was reached that committed Georgia to avoid war against certain territories. The language of such promises was formal and binding, designed to protect religious interests while leaving room for defensive warfare elsewhere. Sozlan's campaigns could be framed as response rather than expansion. Seljuk raids struck Georgian borderlands and were repelled. Local lords fought to preserve territory, pushing enemy forces back. Then, an unexpected spark reignited internal danger. Yuri, the rejected husband, reappeared in the region, welcomed by rulers who wanted to weaken Georgian dominance. In 1191, he reached Erzurum, where political enemies inside Georgia gathered around him. Some came from Tao-Klarjeti and other provinces, and the list included men connected to government and finance. The pattern suggested that certain merchant interests and aristocratic networks, once responsible for bringing Yuri into Georgia, now saw him as a tool to reverse Tamar's consolidation. The rebels moved fast, penetrating deep into western Georgia and staging a dramatic counter-coronation at the palace of Geguti near Kutaisi. Tamar's initial reaction was negotiation. She sent senior churchmen as envoys. The rebels refused compromise. They split their forces, one wing moving to seize strongholds toward the interior, the other burning and preparing to take key southern fortresses. Tamar responded with loyal troops, striking the southern wing first and destroying it near the contested frontier. News of that defeat shattered rebel confidence, and panic spread. Leaders surrendered publicly, ropes around their necks, offering to deliver Yuri if his life was spared. Tamar's answer revealed both firmness and restraint. Yuri was sent back toward Constantinople again, this time without compensation. Rebel leaders were stripped of posts but spared execution. Tamar replaced them with loyal commanders, elevating the Mukagadzeli brothers to the highest responsibilities. One major traitor, Guzan of Tao, fled and attempted to bargain with Muslim neighbours by handing over fortresses, then tried to resume resistance from the mountains. He was captured with his family. Here, Sozlan acted more brutally than Tamar preferred. Guzan was blinded before trial, and when Guzan's son attempted a rescue, the royal army crushed the effort and recovered the strongholds that had been handed to the enemy. The birth of the heir in 1192 was marked not only with celebrations and gifts, but with an assertion of strength abroad. Sozlan invaded Azerbaijan and seized the old regional capital of Bardavi, then moved westward to strike Erzurum, emphasizing intimidation and extraction rather than permanent annexation. These actions prompted a broad reaction. Seljuk rulers appealed to the Abbasid Caliph, who called for a united holy war against Georgia. A new coalition formed under Abu Bakr, the Atabeg of Azerbaijan, a man whose rise to power had been soaked in family violence and political murder. He began by attacking Shirvan, Georgia's ally, exploiting a moment of weakness after an earthquake devastated the region. The ruler of Shirvan fled and appealed for help, arriving at the Georgian court with family and supporters. Georgia offered welcome and protection. a rival claimant within the Atabeg's family, promised Georgia territory in exchange for support. But the Georgian leadership avoided tying itself to ambitions that seemed too vast and unstable. Instead, they moved against the immediate threat. Yuri refused to disappear. In 1193, he resurfaced again in service to the Atabeg and was placed in authority along the frontier. He married into Kipchak circles, raised forces, and raided Georgian lands in the southeast. The response was swift. A Georgian duke defeated him. Some sources imply that he was imprisoned in a monastery, and his final fate remains uncertain. But he vanishes from the political stage after this last failure. Meanwhile, Georgian forces pushed outward on multiple fronts. In 1193 and 1194, Zachariah Mkargadzeli fought along the Araxes corridor, striking cities and fortresses and deepening Georgian influence across Armenia. The decisive test came in 1195 at Shamkor in Azerbaijan. There, under Sozlan's command, Georgian forces met the Muslim coalition in a battle remembered as one of the great victories of Georgian memory. At a critical moment, Sozlan rescued endangered commanders, broke through defensive positions, and struck the enemy from behind. Standards associated with the caliph's cause were captured and sent as trophies to a Georgian monastery. Shamkor fell. Ganja surrendered without a fight. A Georgian Shirvani force advanced, and the city was entrusted to Georgia's ally as a vassal administration. The triumph did not end the war. Abu Bakr escaped, regrouped, and answered with assassination, poisoning the ally installed in Ganja. He retook the city, and conflict in Azerbaijan continued in bursts for years, devastating trade routes and settlements. Georgian pressure deepened the Atabeg's insecurity, and later tradition depicts him sinking into despair and self-destruction. Georgian campaigns reached Nakhichevan, a major trading city that paid tribute and enriched the royal treasury. Control or dominance over strategic markets and caravan routes became as valuable as territorial conquest. Regional states in Iran and Turkmen polities began offering friendship, recognizing Georgian power even as the long-term consequence of these victories would be the gradual formation of stronger resistance. While Soslan's main efforts moved east and south, Ivana Mkargadzeli led campaigns farther west and across Armenia, taking a sequence of cities and fortresses from Muslim rulers and placing them under Georgian authority. By the early 1200s, Georgia's expansion had become enormous in scale, and even with economic prosperity and increased population, the kingdom struggled to keep enough troops in the field to hold a far-flung empire. There was also a diplomatic constraint. Georgia had made agreements designed to avoid provoking powerful Ayyubid rulers, and pushing too far risked breaking those understandings. A new challenge emerged from Anatolia. The Seljuk Sultan of Rum, ambitious and aware of Byzantine weakness, aimed to extend influence along the Black Sea and into contested eastern territories. He replaced Georgian clients in Erzurum with his own appointees and prepared a broader campaign against Georgia and Christian Transcaucasia. At first, diplomacy smoothed the surface. Gifts were exchanged. Then, an insulting message arrived, dismissing a woman ruler as weak and accusing Georgia of oppression of Muslims. The envoy demanded submission and added a humiliating ultimatum: conversion and marriage, or defeat and degradation. The Georgian response at court was immediate and furious. One of the leading commanders struck the envoy down, declaring that only diplomatic immunity saved his life. The messenger returned to Erzurum, not realizing that war had already been declared and that a Georgian army was moving behind him with astonishing speed. The campaign culminated at Basiani in July 1202. Georgia assembled the largest force it had ever fielded. led by Soslan and the greatest commanders of the realm, including the Makar-Gadzeli brothers and other prominent nobles. Tamar accompanied the army as far as a monastic complex on Georgian soil, where she prayed and addressed the troops before sending them onward. The Seljuk Sultan gathered a similarly vast host and camped in southern Tao. The Georgian army struck by night, achieving surprise, yet the Seljuk forces rallied fiercely. The fight became so desperate that Georgian cavalrymen dismounted and battled on foot. At the turning point, reserve wings swept in, encircled the enemy, and broke the coalition. Later, accounts blamed confusion and rumour for the collapse, including the story of the Sultan's horse becoming trapped and a false report of his death spreading through the camp. Whatever the precise trigger, Basiani ended as a crushing Georgian victory, with major captives taken and ransoms paid. Beyond trophies and prisoners, Basiani had an intellectual consequence. Among the captured goods was a medical compendium that was translated and used to build Georgian medical learning, feeding into the curriculum of Georgian academies. The state's leading minister supported projects that ranged from scholarship to engineering works, including sophisticated water supply systems for monasteries. War and culture developed side by side. Georgia could fight large campaigns while also translating romances and epics and supporting a court culture that prized literature, learning, and monumental building. After Basiani, Georgia looked like the dominant Christian power of the region. The Sultan of Rum died not long afterward, and his successors struggled to respond. The Fourth Crusade's destruction of Constantinople in 1204 further transformed the political map. In that moment, Georgia positioned itself as the main protector and organizer of Christian power in the east. Georgian armies pushed into regions long contested, taking Manzikert, striking at Klat, and threatening Erzurum. At times, coalitions managed to inflict setbacks, yet Georgian forces recovered and, by 1206, occupied Erzurum and Kars, gaining control over important caravan posts used by European merchants trading between Europe and Iran. But overreach carried a cost. Ivane Makar-Gadzeli besieged Klat and was captured. His release required a truce, a massive ransom, and a marriage alliance that tied Georgian and local interests together. Soon afterward, the Ayyubids intervened to impose order, installing their own ruler in Klat and setting a new boundary that limited Georgian ambitions west of the Araxes. Soslan died in 1207. After that, Tamar's personal presence in the narrative becomes faint, even though Georgian expansion continued. The Eldigu's realm struggled with internal conflict, and Georgian forces continued to pressure southeastern frontiers. Then, disaster struck in 1209. While the court celebrated Easter at Gaguti, the ruler of Ardabil launched a sudden attack through Ani's open gates, stormed churches, massacred thousands, and looted the city. Georgia's response was brutal and deliberately timed as a mirror image, striking Ardabil's mosques at the start of Ramadan, killing civilians and taking the ruler's family as hostages. The violence was sacrilegious on both sides, a grim reminder that the era's wars could tear through sacred spaces when political rage boiled over. The Makar-Gadzeli brothers then carried Georgian arms deeper into Iran. After consultation at council, Tamar authorized an advance around the southern shore of the Caspian toward Khwarezmia. The campaign's reputation preceded it. Major cities opened their gates and paid tribute to avoid destruction. Resistance was sporadic. The hardest problem for the invaders was not battle but logistics, hauling enormous booty back across long distances. Wealth flowed to nobles, the treasury, and the church, and the crown made gestures to share spoils with the poor. Even contemporaries were astonished that Georgian armies were operating in lands many at home had barely heard named. Eventually, the leadership halted the advance, wary of stretching lines too far and provoking a larger, united response. At the same time, Georgia found a more profitable and less bloody path to influence on the Black Sea. After 1204, the Byzantine world fractured, and along the coast, new possibilities opened. Tamar seized a long stretch of shoreline from Sinop to Trebizond, populated by Greeks and Laz, and created a buffer state subordinate to Georgia. The public justification drew on an incident in Constantinople involving Georgian monks carrying royal gifts for a monastery in the Holy Land. There was also a dynastic angle. Two young Komnenos princes, raised at the Georgian court after violence in Byzantium, had destroyed their security, could be presented as legitimate heirs in exile. In 1204, one of them was installed as emperor at Trebizond. Georgia provided military backing and garrisons in key ports, while maintaining the useful fiction that it was not conquering, but restoring rightful order for displaced Byzantines. The last major military task of the period was internal. Between 1210 and 1213, a coalition of highland groups from Georgia's northern regions and neighbouring mountain peoples rose in rebellion. Their turbulence increased after illness, and death removed one of Georgia's most gifted commanders. Ivane Makagradze intervened with ruthless efficiency. He demanded a new hereditary title that outranked existing ranks, then marched into the peaks, dividing Europe and Asia, split enemy alliances, isolated one group until it deserted, and pacified the region within months. Georgia, at this moment, reached its greatest territorial extent, and if the Trebizond state is counted within its orbit, its influence stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian and deep into the south. After Sozlan's death, Tamar crowned her teenage son, Giorgi IV, as co-ruler, a step meant to secure succession and calm the court. Yet Tamar herself receded further as trusted ministers died one by one. Her last close advisor was Ivan, now holding the highest military office. In her final months, Tamar was absorbed by illness, likely severe and worsening. She spoke openly in council of a private affliction she'd concealed for years, so as not to alarm the kingdom during continuous warfare. She was carried to her palace at Tibilisi, attended by doctors and priests, and died in January 1213. Before her death, she commended both her children to her subjects as successors, attempting to stabilize the future one last time. The question of her burial became a legend of its own. Searches and rumors placed her tomb in major monasteries and even in the Holy Land. A Crusader letter suggested that her son hoped to bring her remains to Jerusalem, though it does not confirm success. Later discoveries of female burials fueled speculation without decisive proof. Stronger evidence points toward Gelati, where later royal visitors prayed at a chapel associated with her tomb and where memorial services have long been held in her name on a traditional date in May. The uncertainty only strengthened the myth. From the moment he took the throne in 1213, Giorgi IV, known as Lasha, revealed remarkable energy, military skill, and an unusually broad curiosity about the world. Yet his boldness and impulsive nature troubled the court. Senior officials, especially the powerful commander and statesman Ivane Makagradze, who had helped guide the young ruler's education, feared that the new king's confidence could easily become recklessness. The immediate priority for the kingdom after his accession was to demonstrate strength to its dependent territories and reaffirm the authority established under earlier rulers. The first challenge came from Azerbaijan. Uzbek, the regional Atabeg, withheld the tribute that symbolized Georgian dominance. Ivan Makagadzeli responded swiftly, leading Georgian forces to Ganja and imposing pressure through a siege rather than a direct assault. This cautious strategy was intended to secure submission without devastating the city. Giorgi, however, grew impatient. Acting independently, he separated a force of 4,000 soldiers and attempted a surprise attack from the rear. The defenders seized the opportunity and struck back fiercely. Although Georgian troops ultimately prevailed, the victory came at a high cost in lives. With famine threatening the besieged population, Uzbek requested peace and resumed payment of tribute. But the king's rash action earned sharp criticism from his own commanders. Soon afterward, Giorgi provoked conflict not on the battlefield but within the church. During a visit to Kakheti, he became captivated by a young woman from the village of Velistike. She was of free birth but not noble, and she was already married. Giorgi took her as his companion and brought her to court, ignoring both social convention and religious authority. In 1215, she gave birth to a son, later known as David Ulu, whom the king entrusted to his sister Rusudan for upbringing. Church leaders and royal officials confronted the king, condemning the scandal. The woman was escorted away by nuns and returned to her husband. Yet Giorgi stubbornly declared her his true wife and refused to accept any political marriage arranged by the court. His defiance alarmed the aristocracy. By refusing a legitimate union, he endangered the succession and isolated himself from the established order. Increasingly, he dismissed experienced ministers and preferred the company of companions of his own age, further unsettling the political elite. Seeking distraction and glory, Giorgi turned again to war. Georgia's dominance in Azerbaijan remained fragile, and new forces were emerging beyond the Caspian. The rising empire of Khwarezmia had begun aggressive expansion, viewing Georgia as a rival in the struggle for influence across Iran. In 1215, the Khwarezmian ruler advanced into Azerbaijan and compelled Uzbek of Ganja to accept his authority. The following year, Georgian forces marched south, prompting Uzbek to appeal to the Khwarezmian Shah. The Shah warned Giorgi that Azerbaijan now lay under his protection. His name was proclaimed in public prayers and his image appeared on coinage. A large army was prepared to confront Georgia, and only the sudden appearance of a new threat in Central Asia prevented a full invasion. At the same time, economic difficulties troubled Georgia's territories. Evidence from inscriptions in Ani reveals severe inflation and social tension. Church fees for basic religious rites had risen sharply, placing heavy burdens on ordinary people. The clergy demanded large payments and additional offerings, while the laity resisted and boycotted services. Church authorities eventually intervened to reduce fees and restore balance. These economic pressures help explain why several cities hesitated to pay taxes to Tibilisi. While the eastern frontier remained constrained by the growing power of Khwarezmia, the Georgian army asserted its strength in the south. In 1219, Giorgi compelled cities such as Nakhchivan and Erzurum to resume tribute, and he launched another campaign against the defiant stronghold of Klat. By 1220, Georgia had reasserted its authority across the region between Anatolia and Iran. Giorgi's reputation spread even to Western Europe. The papacy, seeking allies for a new crusade, invited Georgia to join efforts to recover Jerusalem. Preparations were considered, and the king intended to depart for the Holy Land. Before any expedition could begin, however, an entirely unexpected danger appeared on the horizon. Reports reached Georgia of strange warriors advancing from the Far East, men of unfamiliar appearance, customs, and discipline. Their origins lay in the vast regions of Central Asia, where a formidable leader had unleashed armies of extraordinary mobility and power. These forces had already shattered the empire of Khwarezmia and swept across neighbouring lands with devastating speed. Their warriors were unmatched archers, mounted on swift horses, and they employed advanced siege weapons that allowed them to destroy even heavily fortified cities. Entire populations were massacred, and settlements reduced to ashes. In late 1220, a Mongol army entered the Caucasus. Their purpose was not immediate conquest of Georgia, but the pursuit of fleeing enemies and the search for winter pastures. They drove Uzbek from Ganja and clashed with a hastily assembled Georgian force led by Giorgi and Ivane Mukagadzeli. The battle ended in heavy Georgian losses, and the brutality of the invaders shocked the region. Atrocities committed during the campaign left the population in terror. Georgian leaders sought alliances with neighbouring rulers, believing that the invaders would withdraw once winter ended. The expectation proved mistaken. Early in 1221, in the depths of winter, the Mongols returned through snow-covered mountain passes. They advanced rapidly, recruiting local allies and striking with ruthless precision. Their forces approached Tibilisi itself. A Georgian army managed to defeat one contingent, but another force fell upon them and inflicted severe losses. After ravaging the countryside, the invaders withdrew temporarily, leaving devastation in their wake. Later that year, they resumed their advance, destroying cities and depopulating entire regions before crossing eastern Georgia once more. This time, Giorgi confronted them with a much larger army. The decisive engagement took place near the Kura River. The Mongols employed a strategy unfamiliar to the Georgians. They attacked fiercely, then feigned retreat, drawing their opponents into pursuit before surrounding and annihilating them with hidden reserves. The Georgian army suffered catastrophic losses. Giorgi himself was gravely wounded in the chest. Though he survived for some time, the injury proved fatal, and he died in January 1223. After their victories, the Mongols departed the Caucasus, continuing their campaigns across distant lands. Many in Georgia believed the threat had passed, underestimating the scale of the new power rising beyond their borders. Before his death, Giorgi attempted to secure the succession by arranging a marriage for his sister Rusudan. He died before the wedding could take place, and in 1224, Rusudan was crowned queen. The years following his death were marked by chaos. Refugees and displaced warriors flooded the region, causing destruction even where Mongol armies were absent. Steppe peoples, fleeing their own lands, attempted to settle in the Caucasus and, when refused, resorted to plunder. Georgian forces eventually drove them back, but instability spread across the frontier. Rusudan's accession faced little opposition. A young queen was preferred to the illegitimate son of Giorgi, whose claim lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many nobles. Unlike her brother, Rusudan relied heavily on advisors and generals, often hesitating in moments of crisis. Her reign was marked by uncertainty and shifting alliances. External threats multiplied, including renewed danger from Khwarezmian forces and the looming return of the Mongols. Seeking security, Rusudan married a prince of Erzurum, who converted to Christianity. Their union produced a daughter and later a son who would become her designated heir. Efforts were also made to renew diplomatic ties with Western Christendom. Messages were sent to the papacy describing the struggle against the Eastern invaders and proposing cooperation with crusading forces. Western leaders responded politely but offered little practical assistance. Many in Europe misunderstood the nature of the Mongol expansion, some even viewing the new power as a potential ally rather than a threat. A far more immediate danger arose in 1225, when Jalal ad-Din, a determined and resourceful ruler who had survived the Mongol destruction of his own empire, returned to rebuild his power. He united much of Iran and Iraq and sought to neutralize Georgia as a rival. Advancing northward, he conquered Azerbaijan and prepared to confront Georgian forces directly. Rusudan ordered her commanders to engage the invaders, but poor strategy led to disaster. At the Battle of Garnesi, the Georgian army collapsed after its main body withdrew prematurely, leaving the vanguard isolated. The defeat shattered morale and marked the first major military failure Georgia had suffered in generations. Although Jalal ad-Din initially refrained from exploiting his victory fully, hoping to secure an alliance against the Mongols, negotiations failed amid mutual distrust and renewed hostilities. Georgian leaders underestimated the threat. Each noble withdrew to defend his own fortress, while the invader reorganized his scattered forces into a unified army. In 1226, his troops advanced on Tibilisi. The Georgian defense collapsed after a disastrous engagement, and the city endured a massacre of enormous scale. Tens of thousands were killed, and the destruction of property and manuscripts dealt a devastating blow to the cultural achievements of the preceding age. Temporary recovery followed, but the cycle of war continued. Georgia recaptured Tibilisi briefly, only for the city to be burned again during renewed fighting. Meanwhile, the Mongols returned to the region, and Jalal ad-Din's power declined under their pressure. Yet the devastation left behind by successive invasions weakened Georgia severely. In the years that followed, Rusudan struggled to preserve her authority. She crowned her young son as co-ruler to secure the succession and sought alliances through marriage and diplomacy. Nevertheless, the renewed Mongol advance proved unstoppable. By the mid-12th century, Mongol forces swept across Georgia, capturing cities, destroying resistance, and reducing much of the country to submission. Local leaders surrendered or fled, and the population endured widespread slaughter and hardship. Facing overwhelming power, Rusudan eventually negotiated terms. The kingdom was divided, with eastern regions under direct Mongol control, while the western territories remained under Georgian rule. Heavy tribute was imposed, and Georgian soldiers were required to serve in Mongol campaigns. Though the monarchy survived, its authority was severely diminished. After years of anxiety and political isolation, Rusudan died in 1245. Her death left the succession uncertain and the country fragmented. The Mongol administration reorganized Georgia into provinces governed by local nobles under imperial supervision. Some regions escaped direct control, but others suffered crushing taxation and economic decline. Almost as soon as Mongol authority settled over the country, a circle of Georgian nobles began looking for a way out. They gathered at Koktastavi in Javaketi and spoke openly about resistance. Not because rebellion sounded heroic, but because daily life had become structurally impossible. The most bitter complaint was military service. Mongol commanders demanded a constant stream of recruits, drawing heavily from men between 15 and 60. In practice, whole communities watched a fifth of their able-bodied males vanish into distant campaigns that never seemed to end, including brutal wars far to the south in Iran. With fewer hands to plough and harvest, villages thinned out. Taxes did not fall with the population. They rose. Peasants, already drained by conscription, could no longer pay dues to local lords, and the nobility who depended on those dues began to feel the same chokehold from below. Meanwhile, the weakened frontier invited new dangers. Turkic nomads, numbering in the tens of thousands, pushed into grazing lands in Tau and Klarjeti. Occupation was not only costly, it was humiliating, and that humiliation sharpened into panic when it became clear that Georgia could no longer protect its own countryside. The conspiracy at Koktastavi drew in most of the regional power brokers. 6 of the 8 provincial heads joined the planning, a sign of how widely resentment had spread. Only two major figures held back and remained aligned with Mongol rule. Yet the rebels discovered the most discouraging reality of the new order. Information travelled faster than armies. Mongol intelligence networks moved with startling speed. Before the plotters could even disperse to recruit men, the news had already raced eastward to the imperial centre. Foreign envoys passing through the region heard whispers of it almost immediately. Mongol officials acted before the conspiracy could become a campaign. Argun Aga's agents seized nearly all the participants. Only the Western lords who had left early for home avoided arrest. By late summer of 1246, the captured nobles were suffering in Ani. Under interrogation, they refused to admit treason. They insisted the meeting had been administrative, a discussion about how to share tax burdens more evenly. The Mongols were not persuaded. Torture followed. Accounts of the prisoners' treatment vary in detail, but they agree on the intent: to break the body in public ways that stripped away status and pride. The captives were bound and exposed to heat and insects, left to endure not only pain, but the psychological blow of being reduced to helplessness. It was meant to be a lesson to every lord in the country. At that moment, one man turned the story. Sotne Dadiani had already begun moving back toward the meeting point with a small force, unaware that the net had closed. When he learned of the arrests at the Gado Pass, he did not retreat. He walked into Mongol hands with only 2 companions. Brought to the prisoners, he did something the interrogators did not expect. He stripped himself and joined them, choosing their humiliation as his own. When questioned, he gave the same answers the others had given and demanded execution if execution was to be the punishment. The display was so stark that it shifted the Mongols' calculation. They saw honour and perhaps usefulness in such a figure. Instead of staging a mass punishment that could ignite larger unrest, they reversed course. The conspirators were acquitted and reinstated. Even after the prisoners' release, the political landscape remained unstable. Igaslan Bakutsikeli had accumulated such influence that other nobles feared he might seize the vacant throne outright. To block that possibility, they swallowed an old prejudice and reached for a controversial solution. They called for David, the adult son of Giorgi IV, now around 30 years old, despite his illegitimate birth. The Mongols, however, insisted that Rusudan's son, David Narin, must also present himself for confirmation. The result was an extraordinary spectacle in the distant imperial world. 2 Davids, each with supporters and each with a plausible claim, summoned to argue their rights in front of the great Khan. A Georgian envoy admitted that local law could not cleanly settle the question. One claimant came from the male line, but lacked legitimacy. The other was legitimate yet traced through the female line. The Mongols had little interest in such distinctions. Their own customs were shaped by different family structures and by a political logic that valued order above fine legal theory. They decided by seniority. Giorgi IV's son was declared the senior king, David Ulu. Rusudan's son became the junior king, David Narin. Then came the twist that left Georgians uneasy. Both were installed as rulers in Tibilisi, with the younger formally subordinate to the older. It was a compromise designed not to honour Georgian tradition, but to prevent a single Georgian monarch from becoming too strong. By the end of 1248, both kings had returned to Tibilisi. The Mongols dismantled the provincial framework they had used earlier and restored a more centralised arrangement, now anchored by the 2 kings under Mongol oversight. At first, the pair acted as a unit. Decrees carried both signatures. Their initial priority was to reassert royal authority over nobles who had taken advantage of the royal absence. A powerful lord in the Pankisi Gorge had extended control over much of Kakheti, behaving like an independent ruler. David Ulu pushed through and executed him, a rare moment when a Georgian king managed to impose consequences despite Mongol constraints. Yet some figures were protected by the occupiers. Sargis Jakeli, who made no secret of preferring Mongol patronage to obedience toward Georgian kings, could not be touched. The Mongols rewarded him for strategic loyalty by granting him wide autonomy in Samtskhe, covering much of southern Georgia. That autonomy effectively created a new political organism inside the kingdom. Within a year, the arrangement of 2 kings and 1 imperial master began to fracture. Over a dinner conversation, David Ulu spoke about the possibility of resistance. Mongol ears were everywhere. Officials reacted instantly, shacking the talkers and hauling them in. This time, the incident was dismissed as careless speech rather than an active plot, but the price of forgiveness was heavy. Ransom paid in horses and money. Through most of the 1250s, uneasy coexistence continued. The burden on society, however, kept rising. Mongol conquests stretched from Iran toward the eastern Mediterranean, and the empire needed soldiers, supplies, and cash to feed both armies and an expanding administrative machine. The problem for the Mongols was that oppression shrank the very base they taxed. People fled, artisans disappeared, harvests fell, and yet demands grew. In 1254, a sweeping census was ordered, one of the most comprehensive the region had ever seen. Officials counted males of military age, livestock, mills, vineyards, fish ponds, workshops, and businesses. At first, clergy of all faiths were excluded, along with their property and sanctuaries. After the census, taxation was reorganized into a dense web of obligations. Some levies were moderate on paper. A sales tax was set at a few percent. Certain dues funded official salaries, road maintenance, and the courier system. Tolls on bridges and roads were justified as a way to maintain security and track movement, discouraging banditry. The postal relay system became so effective that communication across the country reached a level of speed and regularity rarely seen before or afterward. Efficiency, however, did not mean mercy. The combined weight of taxes on land, livestock, and households, along with forced labour requirements, drove many communities to starvation. Estimates suggest a grim arithmetic. A large share of a peasant's income went to Mongol demands, another large share to Georgian lords, and additional extractions to officials and tax collectors. Emergency levies appeared during famine. Variable wealth taxes targeted nobles and merchants. Demands for provisioning the army became almost industrial, requiring not only grain and wine, but also rope, livestock for slaughter, and even items like arrows and horseshoes. Corruption multiplied the pain. Officials skimmed beyond their quotas. Tax farmers, who paid a fixed sum to the treasury in exchange for collection rights, squeezed as much as they dared from those beneath them. The worst pressure point was conscription. After the census, recruitment was fixed, at a rate that forced households to produce soldiers with relentless regularity. Georgian troops gained a reputation for toughness and discipline. They were often placed at the front of battle lines, yet frequently denied the share of loot that made service bearable in other armies. Even when one major campaign ended, new wars followed immediately, shifting from fortress sieges in Iran to battles against other powers farther west. In this environment, resentment spread in unexpected directions. The church, exempt from many taxes, began acquiring land from desperate peasants and impoverished lords. It grew rich as ordinary society grew poor. Building projects that survived the era often belonged to religious institutions, since the church was one of the few bodies able to commission skilled labour. Later, when Mongol rulers in the region adopted Islam, new taxes were attempted on non-Muslims, but such measures risked igniting revolt and were not consistently enforced. Open rebellion finally erupted. In 1259, unrest flared in Azerbaijan, and in that same summer, Davit Narin launched a rebellion of his own. Mongol forces responded with killings and mass captures, but struggled to impose full control. Davit Narin fled west and was proclaimed king in Kutaisi, ruling a western realm that quickly distanced itself from Mongol taxation and conscription. The break did not immediately become a formal partition, because soon Davit Ulu also turned toward rebellion. He was pushed by the relentless demands placed on his kingdom and by the humiliations inflicted even on the royal court. Mongol officials ate from the royal kitchens, taxed royal herds, and eventually demanded that Davit Ulu cover Davit Narin's arrears. That demand became the final insult. Davit Ulu gathered a council in Java Keti and, supported by Sargis Jakali, defied the Mongols. Some nobles joined him, others were offered the choice to remain loyal to the empire. Many chose the Mongols. Senior figures such as Ivana Mukhargadzeli and the royal treasurer sided with imperial authority, returning to fortress strongholds and joining a punitive Mongol army. The Mongols also struck the king where it hurt most. Davit Ulu's queen and their infant son were seized and taken east as hostages. Davit Ulu's force was small compared to the Mongol army he faced. Advice from allies pushed him into open battle near Gori. The result was a rout. Reinforcements arrived, and Mongol troops ravaged Samtskhe for weeks, though even they struggled to take certain mountain citadels. When brute force failed to restore obedience fully, punishment turned personal. The queen was executed, as was a prominent commander, whose primary crime was family connection to the king's allies. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty offered no shield against the empire's logic of collective punishment. After this, Davit Ulu and Sargis Jakeli abandoned open resistance and fled west to join Davit Narin. Even there, unity failed. Two kings in one refuge produced rivalry rather than strength. The western nobility split into factions, and a bizarre attempt was made to divide cities, treasure, and subordinate lords as if a kingdom could be portioned like an estate. The arrangement collapsed. Davit Narin remained in the west, while Davit Ulu returned east to negotiate. Surprisingly, the Mongols proved practical. Eastern Georgia was difficult to manage without a Georgian king acting as intermediary. Merchant migration was already draining Tibilisi and other centres as traders sought safety and predictability in the west or in foreign cities. In Davit Ulu's absence, a wealthy merchant had become the dominant figure in the capital, and the Mongols wanted that power checked. During interrogation, Davit Ulu and his ally framed their disobedience as a response to unbearable taxation. Skilled interpretation and diplomatic phrasing softened their apology. Then luck intervened. Urgent news arrived that a rival Mongol power was advancing through the Caucasus. The Western Mongol world was beginning to fracture into competing states. Under this pressure, the Mongol leadership needed Georgian support. Davit Ulu was restored and sent to fight in imperial campaigns. By 1264, he was permitted to resume his reign in Tibilisi. Georgia, now split between west and east, faced a future of further fragmentation. In the west, Davit Narin's long reign brought immediate relief from imperial taxation and conscription. Stability grew, but it came with a foreign policy designed to weaken the Mongols by supporting their enemies. Alliances were cultivated with northern steppe powers and with Muslim rivals of the Ilkhanate, extending diplomatic reach into Anatolia and even Egypt. Dynastic marriages tied the western court to Byzantium. the Western Church began developing its own hierarchy alongside the all-Georgian Patriarchate in Tibilisi, reinforcing the separation. These choices carried costs. Refugee armies that were welcomed as allies demanded vast supplies and became a threat themselves. Conspiracies emerged, some backed by Mongol forces crossing mountain passes. Kutaisi was attacked. Assassination attempts followed. After repeated plots, the Western king finally responded with harsh executions and deportations, showing that independence did not automatically mean gentleness. Meanwhile, control over the Black Sea coast weakened. Trebizond, once firmly within Georgia's orbit, drifted toward Byzantine influence through marriage ties. The Western king attempted an invasion but failed to take the city. At the same time, Samtskhe began to rise as a third Georgian power. Sargis Jakeli convinced the Mongols to treat Samtskhe as crown lands under his personal authority. Lightly taxed and relatively autonomous, Samtskhe attracted runaway peasants and artisans escaping the east. It became the one Georgian region where construction, legislation, and economic growth continued at scale. The Mongols tolerated and even benefited from this arrangement, since Samtskhe's army helped block Turkic nomads from settling vital pastures. In the east, life under Mongol suzerainty remained bleak. Rival Mongol powers fought over grazing lands and trade routes. Georgian troops were dragged into these internecine wars, ordered to build massive defensive works, and forced into campaigns that offered little reward. Large numbers of peasants were pulled away from farms to dig trenches and raise ramparts. Harvests failed. Trade links were severed. Repeated invasions scorched both banks of the Kura, leaving once fertile lands barren for decades. Whole towns were erased. Archaeological traces of slaughter, burned churches, and destroyed bishoprics testify to the scale of the catastrophe. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture were ruined beyond repair. The social order cracked. Mongol herds and caravans trampled crops during seasonal migrations. Foreign mercenaries and settlers were planted in key towns, altering local balances of power. The countryside emptied as peasants fled, taxes, hunger, and conscription. Even monasteries struggled to collect tithes. Nobles donated serfs to church estates, because the church, protected by exemptions, could shelter them better than secular lords could. Land lost value because few could afford to buy it, and money became scarce. Only the church had the revenue to purchase property from desperate owners. Documents from the era capture the inversion bluntly. Precious metals became more valuable as the countryside became cheaper. The monarchy tried to claw back resources by challenging earlier grants of land. This brought the king into direct conflict with the church, which defended its holdings and threatened spiritual sanctions. Royal decrees attempted to nullify old grants unless reconfirmed at accession, arguing that land ultimately belonged to the crown. The struggle achieved little material relief. The treasury remained empty and the peasantry remained crushed. In 1270, David Ulu died, reportedly from disease contracted amid the unsanitary conditions of forced labour on the imperial fortifications. His heir, Dimitri, was only 11. Real power fell to a regent, Sadun Mankabadeli, a man of humble origin elevated by the Mongols for his usefulness and loyalty. The young king grew up in a Georgia that had shrunk, borders had contracted. Samtskhe held the south. The east remained bound to imperial demands. Only after the regent's death could Dimitri begin to act independently. Dimitri's reign combined personal piety with military obligation. He married into Trebizond and later formed ties to Mongol elites, relationships that provoked condemnation from church synods. Yet the urban population admired him for public charity. He fought repeatedly for the Mongols in hard campaigns, suffering severe losses among Georgian contingents. His courage earned respect, but it also tied his fate to the internal feuds of the empire. Court politics among Mongol rulers were merciless. When a powerful Mongol emir was executed for conspiracy, kinship links became death sentences. Dimitri, as a relative by marriage, was summoned to the horde. The Georgian political elite understood the dilemma. Refusal risked a punitive invasion that could depopulate the remaining heartlands. Flight to the mountains or to the Western Kingdom offered a chance of survival, but could invite the same disaster on those left behind. After consultation with nobles and clergy, the king chose to go, bringing gifts, his infant son and senior churchmen, in the hope that loyalty and sacrifice might save the country. The convoy was seized on arrival. An inventory was made of the king's property. A short trial ended in a death sentence. Even then, execution was delayed while the Mongols searched for a workable successor. A rival faction pressed for a solution that would suit the empire. Install a Western prince as king in the east, potentially reuniting the country under imperial control. The plan was approved. Dimitri was publicly beheaded in March 1289. The nobles of Kartli and Kakheti quickly pledged allegiance to the new ruler, believing reunification might finally stabilize their shattered land. Yet the Mongols' design did not hold. Death intervened again. The new king died within a few years, and the Western king followed shortly after. Succession became uncertain in both halves of the country, while Samtskhe remained unusually stable under its own dynasty. In the east, a young prince of Dimitri's line was placed on the throne, just as the Ilkhanate itself lurched into chaos through coups, rival claimants, and sudden ideological shifts. Georgian kings were forced to choose sides among Mongol factions, and the wrong choice could trigger punishment. When a new Ilkhan seized power, he decided to discipline the Georgian monarch for past alliances. Summoned to the imperial court, the king refused and fled to the highlands, fortifying mountain strongholds and trying to survive through guerrilla, resistance, and desperate diplomacy. Offers were made to open mountain passes to northern Mongol enemies, a gamble born of exhaustion and fear. The Ilkhan responded with negotiations, threats, and finally a punitive expedition, recruiting Georgian nobles themselves to help ravage their own country. The cycle that had begun with occupation and taxation now deepened into the harshest form of imperial control, forcing local elites to become instruments of the violence that kept them in line. The struggle for control over Georgia continued into the final years of the 13th century. In 1299, the Ilkhan Ghazan fulfilled his threat to remove David VIII from power and replaced him with his youngest brother, Giorgi V. Yet this change brought little stability. Georgi's authority barely extended beyond Tibilisi and the land surrounding the capital, while much of the country remained outside his control. Only a few years later, in 1302, Ghazan again intervened, removing Giorgi and installing another brother, the even younger Vakhtang III. Vakhtang's rule did not end the conflict. His campaign against David VIII was hesitant and ineffective. Mongol forces established their base at Mokrani and spread across Kartli, launching repeated offensives over several years. David VIII continued to resist. At times, he achieved surprising victories, such as the Battle of Tskavati, where hundreds of Mongol soldiers were killed. However, his cause was weakened by Georgian nobles, who sided with the invaders. Regional lords, southern armies, and Ossetian forces assisted the Mongols in driving David from the lowlands. Only the mountain communities remained loyal to him, a loyalty that provoked harsh reprisals. Mongol troops burned large parts of Kartli and the highland regions in an attempt to break resistance. Eventually, Ghazan offered a temporary peace. He promised to remove Vakhtang III if David VIII would cooperate in military campaigns against the northern Mongol forces known as the Golden Horde. Negotiations were organized in the Mongol headquarters at Mukhrani, where Georgian religious leaders and officials met Mongol representatives. Despite these efforts, the talks collapsed. Vakhtang remained on the throne and even agreed to rule eastern Georgia jointly with his brother. Yet his position required him to serve the Mongols beyond Georgia's borders. Georgian and Armenian soldiers were deployed in campaigns across Syria and Palestine, fighting wars that served Mongol ambitions rather than Georgian interests. During these years, Mongol armies reached Jerusalem and removed its city gates. European observers celebrated the event as a liberation of the Holy City, and the involvement of Georgian troops appeared to fulfill long-standing aspirations of Georgian rulers to reclaim influence in the region. Meanwhile, David VIII continued his resistance from the mountains. For nearly a decade, he waged a relentless guerrilla struggle. His limited territory suffered not only from Mongol attacks, but also from raids by neighbouring tribes seeking to exploit the chaos. The political and economic structure of eastern Georgia collapsed. Cities declined into small settlements. Sections of Tibilisi lay abandoned and were converted into vineyards. Trade routes that once crossed the region shifted elsewhere, bypassing Georgia entirely. Economic output fell dramatically, and agriculture nearly ceased to function. Famine spread widely, forcing the population to survive on whatever could be found. Corpses lay unburied in fields and streets, while thousands fled toward regions less affected by violence. These conditions created deep divisions within Georgian society. Ethnic tensions increased as immigrant groups aligned themselves with Mongol authorities against local populations. The devastation became so severe that even Mongol leaders recognized the danger of destroying the very land they sought to control. Ghazan issued orders limiting looting and forbidding the killing or enslavement of peasants by nobles. He attempted to stabilize the countryside by binding peasants permanently to the land and granting landowners authority to recover those who fled. Taxation was reorganized to reduce immediate pressure, and crown lands were distributed to military units as compensation for lost income. Some rebuilding took place, although areas devastated by punishment campaigns were largely neglected. Despite these reforms, the Mongols could not eliminate resistance in the mountainous regions. David VIII maintained his position in remote strongholds that proved impossible to conquer. His survival owed much to the support of foreign allies, including the ruler of Egypt, who restored Georgian religious sites in Jerusalem and granted Georgian pilgrims free access to the city. By the early 14th century, the Mongols were too occupied with conflicts elsewhere to pursue him further. He retained control of parts of the southern highlands until his death in 1308. After David's death, the political situation remained unstable. His brother Vakhtang died soon afterward, leaving a young heir unable to exercise real authority. The Mongol leadership installed the child Giorgi VI as king, while entrusting governance to his uncle Giorgi V as regent. Although this arrangement theoretically united the kingdom, the rulers lacked the resources to control both eastern and western regions effectively. Western Georgia was itself divided. Following the death of King David Narin, rival claimants struggled for power. One brother maintained control of the capital while another ruled from the mountains, mirroring the division that had long characterized the eastern territories. For decades, Georgia remained fractured, weakened by internal rivalry and external domination. A turning point came after the death of the young king Giorgi VI in 1313. Giorgi V once again assumed the throne, this time determined to restore national unity. He secured cooperation from powerful Mongol officials who granted him greater autonomy in exchange for military assistance against rebellious factions. Georgian forces were deployed beyond their borders in one final series of campaigns serving Mongol interests. Soon afterward, Giorgi was formally recognized as ruler of the entire Georgian realm, including western territories and southern principalities. With his authority strengthened, Giorgi moved swiftly to reassert royal power. Disloyal nobles were punished or removed, and alliances were cultivated abroad. Diplomatic missions were sent to Egypt, securing privileges for Georgian religious institutions and pilgrims in Jerusalem. Foreign observers began to speak once again of Georgia's revival. Religious and cultural exchanges expanded. Missionaries arrived, and Georgian representatives travelled abroad. The kingdom's renewed prominence encouraged contacts with European powers and Mediterranean merchants. Yet internal tensions remained. Conflicts between religious communities and competing commercial interests revealed the fragility of this recovery. The decisive break with Mongol dominance came in 1327, when the death of a powerful Mongol patron created an opportunity for independence. Giorgi summoned pro-Mongol nobles to a ceremonial gathering and executed them, eliminating internal opposition. He reclaimed lands lost to religious institutions and financiers and gradually restored royal authority across the countryside. Campaigns were launched against rebellious highland communities, and strategic routes through the Caucasus were secured. By the late 1320s, Giorgi extended his control over western Georgia, removing rival rulers and consolidating power. Regional princes recognized his supremacy, and by 1334 the kingdom was reunited. He earned a title reflecting his reputation as a brilliant and effective ruler. Nevertheless, the land he inherited remained scarred by decades of destruction. Giorgi focused on reconstruction. Military expeditions suppressed banditry and secured the frontiers. Economic life slowly revived as vineyards and orchards restored agricultural production. Trade returned to Tibilisi, attracting merchants of many backgrounds. Legal reforms were introduced to regulate society and replaced traditional systems of personal revenge with structured penalties based on rank and status. These measures strengthened central authority and restored a functioning administrative system. Government institutions were reorganized under a powerful monarchy, supported by ministers and a council of nobles and clergy. The king retained ultimate authority, while officials managed military affairs, finances, internal security, and royal estates. Legislative assemblies continued to meet, but their role remained advisory. The political structure resembled a highly organized feudal state, reflecting both traditional Georgian practices and adaptations developed during the period of foreign domination. Despite these achievements, new dangers emerged. Rival Mongol factions fought battles near Georgia's borders, and instability spread through neighbouring regions. Georgian influence in the Black Sea area weakened as external powers asserted control. Natural disasters compounded the kingdom's troubles. A devastating epidemic struck livestock and population alike, undermining economic recovery. Giorgi died in 1346, leaving the throne to his son, David IX. Almost immediately, a far greater catastrophe struck. The Great Plague that swept across Eurasia reached the Caucasus, killing vast numbers of people and causing social collapse. The disaster proved more destructive than earlier invasions. Many records of the period were lost, leaving the details of David's reign obscure. Georgia struggled to maintain its position amid regional instability. Tribute payments were made to neighbouring rulers to prevent invasion, while some territories were lost. Diplomatic marriages linked the royal family to neighbouring states, but the kingdom's power had diminished. In 1360, David's son, Bagrat V, became king and was crowned in Kutaisi to emphasize his rule over both eastern and western lands. His reign unfolded in a country weakened by recurring waves of disease and economic hardship. Despite limited records, he gained a reputation as a capable warrior and skilled commander. Yet Georgia's recovery remained fragile. From the late 1380s onward, Georgia was dragged into one of the most violent storm fronts the medieval world had ever produced. Between 1386 and 1405, Timur Lang built an empire through relentless campaigning, intimidation, and calculated terror. Only brief pauses interrupted the sequence. The lands between Iran and Anatolia, and between the steppe and Mesopotamia, were repeatedly shaken. Georgia, already weakened by plague, fragmentation, and earlier invasions, faced wave after wave. In all, the country endured 8 separate Timurid incursions, each one leaving fewer people, fewer walls, and less hope. The first blow fell in the early winter of 1386. The background was steppe politics. Toktamish, ruler of the northern horde and Timur's most dangerous rival, moved south after a dramatic raid, deep into Russian lands. Bagrat V of Georgia appears to have permitted Toktamish to cross the Caucasus on the way toward the rich cities of the south, and Georgian fighters were drawn into Toktamish's cause. Timur reacted as a strategist, not merely as a conqueror. He could not allow his enemy easy access to the Trans-Caucasus, and he sent a force that pushed forward even through ice and snow. The advance rolled across the corridor from Kars toward Tibilisi, spreading through valleys and over ridges, so numerous that contemporary observers described the mountains as filled with troops. Georgia's nobility, however, did not meet this army in the open. With few exceptions among younger warriors, most magnates chose survival over battle and withdrew behind stone. Even the king was not given the full rally of his aristocracy. Tbilisi carried the weight of resistance almost alone. The capital endured a siege that stretched for months. Bagrat reportedly rode out repeatedly, striking at siege lines in short counterattacks, trying to keep pressure on the attackers and morale inside the city. Timur's army responded with heavy engineering. Stones were hurled at walls, siege pressure tightened, and the city's defences were battered until the moment of collapse. Bagrat kept fighting from the ramparts into the final phase, but by late November the fortress was broken. A terrifying novelty appeared. Cannon fire, the first such weaponry many in the region had ever seen, added shock to destruction. Timur offered the royal family mercy if they surrendered. Their lives were spared, but the city was not. The troops were turned loose for plunder and slaughter, and the population paid the price for a war that was never truly theirs. What could be carried was carried away. Skilled labourers were selected like trophies, marched east to serve in the conqueror's capital, forced onto grand projects that aimed to glorify Timur's rule. Great quantities of loot followed, precious metal stripped from sacred objects, jewels, and whatever could be taken from palaces and churches. Even collections of manuscripts and court treasures were seized and transported under guard. Timur then moved on, destroying strongholds as he went, but not holding them. This was the pattern: break the backbone, shatter the will, and leave the land hollow. One exception stood out. Shirvan avoided the first disaster by meeting Timur with submission and gifts. Elsewhere, the army fragmented into raiding detachments, while the main force settled into winter quarters in Karabakh. During that winter, Timur attempted something more ambitious than taxation. He wanted conversion. Georgia was to be transformed not simply into a tributary, but into a land that acknowledged his faith and authority in public form. Bagrat, as a captive and a vassal had limited choices. He could accept political obedience, but religious surrender was harder. A compromise was shaped around a form of Islam familiar in Central Asia, presented as practical and flexible. Bagrat outwardly complied. Gifts were exchanged, and the king was sent back toward home, escorted by a large Timurid force described as a mission meant to reshape the country from the top down. That escort did not remain a mission for long. It became the second invasion. As Bagrat neared Georgian territory, messages went out to his sons. Rescue was planned. One of those sons, Giorgi, had been offered a crown in Bagrat's absence, but he refused it, fearing it would give Timur an excuse to kill his father. Instead, Giorgi moved with soldiers into rough terrain and struck the escort in a gorge. The ambush succeeded. Bagrat was freed, and Georgian forces withdrew toward Tibilisi, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. Retaliation came quickly. In early 1387, Timur returned in fury. This time, the capital's people did not remain inside the walls. They fled into the mountains, carrying what they could, abandoning homes to fire and looting. Bagrat sought renewed contact with Toktamish's northern power, hoping steppe rivalry might become Georgia's shield. Fighting followed, and Timurid troops suffered losses, but Georgia could not sustain a field war. Once again, defenders vanished, behind castles and forest. Timur's attention then turned elsewhere, pulled by uprisings and threats across his empire. For Georgia, that distraction meant survival. The invader withdrew, and the kingdom gained several years to breathe. Those years were not peaceful in the wider world. Timur crushed enemies, punished the northern horde, and expanded into major cities of the south, tightening a noose around the Caucasus. Georgia was surrounded by conflict, even when armies were not physically present. In the west, the crisis tempted local ambition. Imeretia's duke decided the east was lost and proclaimed a separate crown. Yet even that break did not hold. When the usurper died, Bagrat reasserted his authority over a reunified Georgia, at least in name. The next shocks arrived in the early 1390s. Timur sent commanders into Samtskhe, Georgia's southern region, to scout routes, gather plunder, and test resistance. A summer raid damaged sacred sites and struck wealthy valleys. An autumn campaign was harsher still, forcing a path across the country toward the Caucasus Ridge. Battles were fought without mercy. Prisoners were not taken. On the horizon, Toktamish hovered like a shadow, and Timur soon turned to crush him decisively along the Terek River, then drove him north again, wrecking key centres and punishing Christian monuments across the northern Caucasus. Once finished, Timur rested in the loyal territory of Shirvan, then returned to the deeper heartlands of his empire. Georgia enjoyed another short pause while Timur campaigned far away, including in India. During that interval, Bagrat died, and his heir Giorgi VII inherited a crown that was more burden than prize. By the end of the decade, Giorgi attempted a bold move. He tried to gather the discontent of the region into a coalition against Timur's tyranny and against the brutality of Timur's son, who ruled the Transcaucasus as a harsh lieutenant. North Caucasian fighters were drawn in. Allies were sought among neighbouring groups, and strategic strongholds were reinforced. Early successes followed. Georgian forces pushed back Timurid generals and won battles that briefly suggested the empire could be resisted. But momentum broke. A key ally was killed, his head taken as a trophy, and the message was sent eastward. Giorgi and a prominent refugee prince retreated into Georgia. Timur now prepared a campaign with a different purpose. Not just punishment, but permanent submission, either through forced incorporation, forced conversion, or annihilation. In the winter of 1399, a carefully chosen army crossed into eastern Georgia with speed and planning. Supplies were limited to force momentum. A bridge was thrown across the river, trails were hacked through forests, and sentries were bypassed. Kakheti and Hereti were struck before civilians could properly hide livestock or move valuables. Even so, resistance did not vanish. A Georgian commander used delaying tactics, pulling the invaders into time-consuming pursuits, while warned communities hid in caves and woodland. Timur's men responded with systematic terror. Churches and monasteries were looted and burned. Refugees were slaughtered in hiding places, and orchards and vineyards were ruined as a deliberate act of long-term damage. Winter weather and lack of forage finally forced the raiders back toward Karabakh, driving flocks ahead of them like captured wealth. The following year, a grand assembly within Timur's empire declared Georgia a target for full conquest. In spring, an envoy arrived demanding that Giorgi surrender the refugee prince who had taken shelter under Georgian protection. Giorgi offered gifts but refused the demand, stating that handing over those who sought refuge violated Georgian custom. Timur answered by branding the Georgians as enemies of the true faith and announcing that their resistance justified eradication. Giorgi again gathered allies and met the Timurid force near Lake Sivan, but the coalition was pushed back. Timur re-entered Georgia, ravaged Tibilisi again, and then unleashed a broad search and destroy campaign across the countryside. Trails through forests were reportedly revealed by informers. Caves were turned into tombs as fire and fuel were used to kill those hiding inside. Fighters chose death over capture when cornered on cliffs. In the wake of Timurid columns, villages fell silent, stripped of life and animals. Giorgi continued to resist, slipping from one threatened zone to another. When the citadel of Tibilisi fell again, he withdrew westward into rougher terrain. Timur pursued into gorges, destroying fortifications and religious centres as he climbed valleys. Fields were burned, cattle taken, towns levelled. Giorgi made stands when he could, then vanished into forest, described by observers as fighting like a wounded beast, rather than a monarch on parade. Nobles were tortured for information but refused to reveal the king's location. Even castles considered unbreakable were tested by heavy engines. Siege machines were dragged into unlikely places, and after brutal exchanges of missiles and hand-to-hand fighting, strongholds fell, populations were massacred, and the pursuit pressed onward into western lands. Timur then turned south again, applying pressure to regional lords, taking hostages, demanding ransom, burning monasteries and locking clergy and worshippers inside churches set alight. Even Georgia's most symbolic sacred centre was damaged. By the end of the year, the devastation resembled near genocide. Survivors were gathered and forced into long marches eastward under guard. Those who collapsed on the road were killed. The countryside was emptied not only by death, but by displacement. Yet even at this point, Giorgi reappeared, rallying loyal dukes and moving toward key mountain passes, where new rebellions flared. Timur was occupied in Anatolia, inflicting atrocities there as well. And his attention shifted toward other great targets. Still, he sent forces back to Georgia when he heard of Georgian movements near long-resisting fortresses on the frontier. Even those places that held out for years eventually surrendered under starvation. Exhausted and desperate, Giorgi opened talks. He offered to meet Timur, hoping to trade submission for survival. Timur's terms were severe: tribute, taxes, and a humiliating levy on non-Muslims. Negotiations produced a truce in late 1401 that promised safe conduct in exchange for annual payment, military service, transit rights for Timurid armies, and formal equality between Muslims and Christians under law. In practice, the conqueror wanted quiet in the Caucasus while preparing to smash larger rivals. Quiet did not last. Timur broke the agreement almost immediately when he moved toward Ottoman territory and encountered defiance at a fortress along his route. A punishment force was sent. The garrison was cut down, the place destroyed. Soon after, in 1402, Timur defeated the Ottoman Sultan at Ankara, shattering Ottoman power and dividing the empire among heirs. In Europe, many celebrated the result, not realizing what it meant for the lands Timur passed through. With the Ottomans weakened, Timur had room to return to Georgia with a final, crushing intent. Georgian nobles tried to stall with gifts and apologies, hoping to secure a harvest before the next blow. Timur then chose a symbolic target, a fortress believed impossible to take, perched on sheer rock above a dry canyon, reachable only by narrow paths and ladders. It was well stocked and defended by a small but determined force. Timur treated its capture as a demonstration of genius and inevitability. Specialist climbers were brought in from distant regions, siege engines were deployed, and new structures were built to dominate the heights. Wells were dug, supplies driven in, and bombardment continued day and night. When the defenders finally relaxed after the barrage stopped, climbers scaled the rock face in darkness and opened the way. The fortress was taken, survivors killed, families distributed as spoil, and a church was converted into a mosque. The district was stripped and granted to a loyal commander. Strategically, this siege mattered less than the message it sent. It was proof that no refuge was truly safe. Still, the time it consumed allowed Georgi to prepare further resistance. Timur's weary army was persuaded that western Georgia must also be punished. To reach it, cavalry needed pasture routes rather than deep forests. The invasion therefore took a long northern detour, broke into Imereti in multiple columns, and tore through settlements and monasteries on a massive scale. Hundreds of villages and farmsteads were burned or emptied, trees destroyed, and communities erased. Yet even this campaign had limits. Dense forests and marshes blocked further movement toward the far northwest, and commanders urged Timur to seek easier conquests elsewhere. This limitation became Georgi's advantage. Timur offered terms that were still humiliating but softer in appearance. Georgia could remain a Christian kingdom, but it had to mint wealth in Timur's honour, deliver horses and rare jewels, and accept that southern lands would remain under Timurid control. Timur withdrew, burning holy sites along the route, but Georgia had endured. When Timur died in early 1405 while preparing another great campaign, his empire fractured into rivalries, and the pressure on Georgia briefly loosened. Georgi moved quickly to reclaim what could be reclaimed. With the region depopulated, armies were small, and campaigns were more like raids than reconquests. Still, Georgian forces struck into contested zones, briefly recovering towns and extending influence toward earlier borders. Neighbouring rulers also filled the vacuum. New threats soon replaced the old. Turkmen confederations surged into the Caucasus, bringing fresh waves of violence. Georgi's forces were overwhelmed, and the king himself was killed before he could secure a stable succession. Stories circulated that his survival until middle age was itself astonishing, given repeated assassination plots and years of war. Power passed to his half-brother Constantine, and even here the record grows thin. Civil conflict stirred within the royal family, and princes sought asylum with powerful regional lords. Constantine fought against the new Turkmen leader, who had built a kingdom out of Timur's ruins, and he tried to coordinate with distant powers, including Muslim states, simply to survive. In 1412, disaster struck during a campaign on the Kura River. A Georgian force was surprised at night, surrendered, and the captives' pride enraged their captor. Constantine, his elder half-brother David, and many others were slaughtered, and the king was beheaded. Like the rulers before him, he died young by modern standards, leaving a battered kingdom behind. His son, Alexandre, took the crown after the body was brought home for burial. Alexandre had been shaped by a very different upbringing, guided by a pious and educated family circle, and raised with an emphasis on faith and rebuilding rather than conquest. He became known not for spectacular victories, but for restoration. His personal life also reflected the era's harshness. A first marriage ended quickly with his wife's death, leaving him children, and he remarried soon after, building a large family whose later roles would affect Georgia's internal balance. At first, Alexandre still had to fight. He joined regional coalitions to push Turkmen forces out of key territories and stabilize the frontier. Over time, pressure eased as Turkmen leaders became absorbed by struggles elsewhere. Alexandre then turned inward. He travelled across western regions to secure loyalty from hereditary lords, confirming their titles after submission, while confronting defiance in the south. A powerful southern prince was captured after rebellion, and although he was ultimately pardoned after oaths, the crown reduced his rights and punished other rebels more harshly. Alexandre restored something like Georgia's old borders, though not all lost cities returned to Georgian control, and recovery remained uneven. The deeper problem was institutional. The older machinery of government had been damaged beyond easy repair. Ministerial offices that once anchored centralized rule no longer carried the same weight. Regional provinces developed their own armies and diplomacy. In the south, a prince sought independence not only through fortresses, but through the church, separating local bishops from the traditional national authority and bringing in outside ordinations. Holy sites became points of conflict, and prayers themselves turned political, omitting the king and national patriarch. The schism was bitter and destabilizing. Local law also diverged. In some regions, detailed codes set fines and blood payments according to rank, and even allowed harsh controls over serfs and fugitives. Elsewhere, the state was too weak to enforce consistent justice, and clergy became the main arbiters. Penalties varied wildly, and religious institutions sometimes used the chaos to extract wealth. Appeals to the king reveal an atmosphere where safety could be purchased, where the rich demanded huge valuations for their lives, and where law served status more than fairness. Alexandre kept rebuilding anyway. Churches, castles, and even distant properties connected to Georgian worship abroad were repaired where possible. A special household levy funded restoration for years, and nobles contributed from their own resources. Yet rebuilding faced brutal limits. Precious metals had been stripped away over generations. Skilled artisans had been deported east long ago, or died on forced marches. Labour was scarce because peasants had been killed, displaced, or trapped in debt. Hungry families sold land, often to the church, and records show vineyards and fields changing hands repeatedly until they ended in ecclesiastical ownership. Serfs moved to masters who could feed them, then were dragged back by force when old owners reasserted claims. To stabilize governance, Alexandre promoted loyal officials in strategic towns, turning some land grants into hereditary offices as an incentive. He resettled mountain communities into deserted valleys and compelled wealthy institutions to support village rebuilding. Groups from different regions were moved to repopulate empty lands. Even steppe peoples were given animals and seed to encourage settlement. Refugees arriving from Muslim-ruled zones also brought skills and commerce, helping revive some districts. Late in Alexandre's reign, Georgia briefly re-entered the diplomatic world of Western Europe. As the Ottoman threat grew, European church councils attempted to unify Christian forces. Alexandre sent delegates, including high-ranking clergy and a royal relative, partly to assert Georgia's standing and partly to prevent internal rivals from using foreign connections to legitimize autonomy. Georgian envoys were treated with remarkable ceremony, their rank placed high among Orthodox delegations. Yet the mission became entangled in doctrinal and political struggle. Reports conflict over whether Georgian representatives accepted union with Rome. Accounts from contemporaries describe pressure, intimidation, and humiliation directed at those unwilling to sign. One Georgian delegate reportedly disappeared in distress and was later found in a broken state, far from the council, then returned home by ship. Back in Georgia, crisis returned. The king became gravely ill, recovered, and then faced a new demand for submission and tribute from Turkmen power. In 1440, an invasion struck during Easter celebrations, catching communities off guard and producing slaughter, mass captivity, and the construction of a gruesome monument of severed heads. The invaders marched toward Tibilisi with prisoners and loot, while the Georgian court argued over whether to resist or yield. The shock appears to have pushed Alexandre toward abdication. In 1442, he renounced the crown and took monastic life, living quietly near the sacred heart of the kingdom until his death a few years later. Succession was not clearly settled. Vakhtang IV ruled briefly without producing an heir. After him, Giorgi VIII arose, attempting to enforce authority across Imereti, Kartli, and Kakheti, but the broader realm had become a patchwork of principalities. The centre could no longer command loyalty through money or force. In the south, Samtskhe continued sliding toward effective independence under a hard and long-ruling prince who again tried to detach the local church from national control. The national patriarch responded with excommunication and disciplinary action, and ordinary people, fearing spiritual consequences, rejected rebellious clergy. The struggle ended with a reluctant return to national authority, though the conflict exposed how fragile unity had become. As Byzantium approached collapse, Giorgi VIII looked west for alliances. Negotiations even began for a royal marriage into the last imperial house, with debates over dowry customs and staggering sums that would have strained Georgia's finances. The plan died with the emperor on the walls of Constantinople. The fall of the city sealed Georgia's isolation. Soon, only Muslim powers surrounded it, and even the remaining Greek state on the Black Sea was living on borrowed time. Despite this, Georgian rulers attempted a last grand strategy: an anti-Ottoman coalition linking Caucasian powers with European states. Papal envoys visited and reported deep internal rivalries. Yet in 1459, coordinated letters went out from Georgia's king and from the southern prince of Samtskhe to the Pope, to Venice, and to Burgundy. They promised enormous armies from Georgia, neighbouring Christian regions, and allied powers, and imagined a campaign that would clear Anatolia in a single season while European forces struck in the Balkans. Delegations were assembled and escorted across the Black Sea and through Central Europe. They met emperors, doges, councils, and kings, speaking in Latin before church authorities and presenting themselves as partners against the Ottoman advance. The reality was bitter. European leaders hesitated, distracted by their own crises, unwilling to risk thrones and treasuries. The Pope himself struggled to understand the delegation's mandates and misidentified titles and rulers. Promises were made, then softened into apologies. The envoys were sent from court to court, chasing support that never solidified. In France, they arrived to find one king dying and the next uninterested in crusade. In Burgundy, they found a duke concerned more with succession than distant war. After ceremonies and polite receptions, the exhausted delegation turned homeward. carrying little more than disappointment. A brief moment of unity among the Georgian rulers quickly dissolved, and internal conflict resumed with renewed intensity. In 1462, Kvakvar II openly challenged King Giorgi VIII, seeking support from Uzun Hasan and securing a decisive victory. Yet the intervention of Uzun Hasan's forces brought destruction rather than stability, as foreign troops reportedly attacked Samtske's clergy and devastated its churches. The following year, another challenge to royal authority emerged. Bagrat, dissatisfied with his limited role as Duke of Kutaisi, was encouraged by Kvakvar to revolt. He defeated Giorgi VIII at Chikori in western Georgia, declared himself King Bagrat II of Imeretia, and secured the loyalty of regional lords by freeing them from taxation. Kvakvar II continued strengthening his own power by distributing territories to allies. He granted Ajaria and parts of Lazistan to the ruler of Guria in exchange for support against rival nobles, eliminating or driving out opposition within Samtske. In a symbolic declaration of autonomy, he established a mint at Akaltsike, producing silver coins that gradually evolved from simple designs into pieces bearing his name and personal mark, signalling Samtske's emergence as an independent political entity. In 1465, King Giorgi VIII attempted to regain control by invading Samtske, but his army was ambushed near Lake Paravani, and he was captured. His nephew, the future Constantine II, escaped and sought refuge in Gori, though even this stronghold was soon besieged. During his captivity, Giorgi was reportedly compelled to marry Kvakvar's daughter, Tamar, who bore him children who later vanished from historical record. Kvakvar's strategy aimed to prevent any single Georgian kingdom from dominating the region, ensuring a balance of rival powers. While Giorgi remained imprisoned, Bagrat of Imeretia advanced into eastern Georgia and crowned himself ruler of all Georgia. The fragmentation of authority accelerated. Once released, Giorgi found himself abandoned in Tibilisi and withdrew to Kakheti, where he began ruling independently. By this time, Georgia had effectively broken apart. Imeretia and Kartli were under Bagrat's rule. Kakheti followed its own monarch, and Samtske operated as a separate realm. Regional principalities such as Mingrelia, Abkhazia, and Svanetia increasingly ignored central authority. Even the church fractured, as competing religious centres rejected the authority of traditional leadership in Mansketa. Foreign observers who passed through Georgia during the 1470s described a land weakened by division and poverty. Venetian envoys travelling across the region encountered depopulated cities, declining trade, and widespread insecurity. Tibilisi, once a thriving capital, appeared largely abandoned, while major towns had shrunk into fortified settlements. Agricultural production had declined, and many regions survived through subsistence farming or small-scale trade. Although Kakheti maintained relative stability, much of the country struggled with banditry, economic hardship, and political instability. Financial decline reflected the broader crisis. Earlier rulers had commanded immense resources, but by the late 15th century, even modest sums proved difficult to raise. Heavy taxation, fragmented governance, and constant warfare had impoverished both nobles and peasants. Serfdom became harsher, towns lost their vitality, and the country suffered from a shortage of skilled artisans and labourers. Yet cultural life did not entirely collapse. Scholars and clerics continued to produce works on medicine, theology, and literature, preserving intellectual traditions despite the political chaos. Following the death of Bagrat VI, further struggles erupted over succession. Rival claimants fought for control of different regions, while external threats multiplied. Turkmen invasions struck repeatedly, capturing cities and establishing garrisons. Local rulers alternately resisted or negotiated, often switching alliances to preserve their power. By the late 15th century, the Georgian nobility recognized that endless conflict threatened the country's survival. In 1490, an assembly of nobles and church leaders accepted the permanent division of Georgia into separate kingdoms and principalities. Rather than attempting reunification, they agreed on defined borders and a pact of non-aggression. This settlement acknowledged the political reality of fragmentation, though it weakened the traditional unified military structure that had once defended the kingdom. Despite internal divisions, Georgian rulers continued seeking support from other Christian powers. Appeals were sent to Russia and Western Europe, hoping for alliances against Muslim empires surrounding the region. Diplomatic missions travelled great distances, but practical assistance never arrived. European rulers expressed sympathy, yet offered only moral encouragement. Meanwhile, Georgia faced growing pressure from two powerful neighbours: the Ottoman Empire to the west, and the rising Safavid state in Iran to the east. Caught between these expanding empires, Georgian rulers were forced to navigate a dangerous balance of submission, resistance, and shifting alliances. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Safavid ruler Shah Ismail sought influence in Transcaucasia. Georgian rulers cooperated with him in campaigns against Ottoman territories, contributing troops and securing temporary gains. However, promises of autonomy proved unreliable, and eastern Georgian kingdoms were gradually reduced to vassal status. The death of King Constantine II further weakened resistance, and neighbouring rulers took advantage of Kartli's vulnerability. Ottoman forces also expanded their influence, launching raids and seizing territory in western Georgia. Internal rivalries intensified the crisis. In Kakhtia, a prince seized power through violence, attacking neighbouring regions and declaring grand titles. In Kartli, competing claimants established new centres of authority. Meanwhile, wars between the Ottoman and Safavid empires repeatedly swept across Georgian lands, turning the country into a battlefield. Cities were looted, churches destroyed, and populations displaced or enslaved. Some Georgian rulers attempted pragmatic policies to ensure survival. Kakhtia, under careful leadership, accepted foreign suzerainty in exchange for peace and economic stability. Other regions chose resistance, engaging in guerrilla warfare against occupying forces. However, constant conflict drained resources and deepened divisions. Strategic cities changed hands repeatedly, and large numbers of inhabitants were deported or sold into slavery. By the mid-16th century, Georgia's fate was largely determined by the rivalry between the Ottomans and Safavids. A formal agreement between the two empires divided the region into spheres of influence. Western Georgia fell under Ottoman control, while eastern territories became subject to Iran. This partition effectively ended hopes for reunification and placed heavy financial and political burdens on the Georgian kingdoms. Tribute payments increased, and foreign garrisons controlled key cities. Some rulers continued resisting domination, launching campaigns to reclaim territory or expel foreign troops. Their efforts occasionally achieved temporary successes, but rarely produced lasting independence. Warfare brought devastating consequences. Depopulated regions, destroyed infrastructure, and social disruption. Entire communities were relocated, and thousands were taken as captives. The Western Kingdom of Imerechia faced severe economic hardship under Ottoman pressure. Coastal regions suffered from piracy and slave raids, and heavy taxation forced many communities to surrender their own people as tribute. Attempts by rulers to reform religious institutions and strengthen authority met limited success, as economic weakness and external control restricted their power. Despite these challenges, cultural and religious traditions endured. Church councils condemned practices such as slave trading and attempted to preserve moral order, even if enforcement remained weak. Across the fragmented Georgian world, political authority shifted constantly, yet the persistence of religious life, scholarship, and local traditions sustained a sense of identity amid prolonged crisis. After Bagrat's death in 1565, Giorgi II ascended the throne of Imereti, inheriting a land already fractured by rivalry and ambition. Western Georgia was dominated by constant struggles among powerful regional elites. The nobles of Guria, Mingrelia, and Imereti fought one another relentlessly, each seeking dominance over the others. Giorgi attempted to strengthen his position by forming an alliance with Guria to limit the growing influence of Giorgi III Dadiani of Mingrelia. In response, Dadiani encouraged rebellious nobles within Imereti and launched open war against Giorgi II in 1568. The king narrowly escaped assassination during these turbulent years. A nobleman named Bezan Nemsadze attempted to kill him in order to place his own nephew on the throne. The conspirators failed to capture the king, but seized his relative Constantine instead. Giorgi did not immediately retaliate. When the opportunity arose, he joined forces with the Prince of Guria and launched an invasion of Mingrelia, capturing the important centre of Zugdidi. Dadiani was forced to flee to Istanbul, seeking assistance from the Ottoman court. The Ottoman authorities, eager to maintain division in western Georgia, provided Dadiani with ships and soldiers drawn from their Black Sea provinces. This intervention altered the balance of power. Guria was intimidated by the show of force, and negotiations followed. Dadiani eventually accepted peace with Guria after receiving financial compensation for a perceived insult connected to a broken marriage alliance. Such marital disputes frequently served as causes for war, and political marriages were repeatedly arranged or dissolved as instruments of power. Before confronting external enemies, Giorgi II first dealt with internal opposition. He invited one of the leading rebel nobles to a banquet, where the man was killed and his lands confiscated. These territories lay across strategic regions bordering Imereti, Guria, and Mingrelia. Soon afterward, Gurian and Mingrelian forces invaded Imereti, seized the confiscated lands, and divided them among themselves. The conflict gradually subsided in 1572, following the sudden death of Levan Dadiani in a hunting accident. His successor was weakened through a marriage alliance linking his family to Giorgi II's heir, which temporarily reduced tensions. A new alliance then emerged against Guria. Political marriages again reshaped relations, yet stability remained fragile. Fighting resumed near Zugdidi, forcing one claimant to flee into exile while his brother assumed control of Mingrelia. Giorgi II demanded the return of disputed lands before recognizing the new ruler. Further power struggles followed, including brief returns of exiled leaders supported by northern Caucasian forces. Territories changed hands repeatedly, as rulers negotiated alliances through marriage and territorial concessions. Eventually, a broad network of marital connections among the leading families of Imereti, Guria, and Mingrelia produced a brief period of stability in the late 1570s. This fragile peace ended when another member of the Dadiani family rebelled. Regional leaders captured the rebel but hesitated to execute him. The king and his allies intervened, ordering his death in prison. Violence remained a constant tool of political control, and personal rivalries often determined the fate of entire regions. While western Georgia struggled with internal conflict, the southern principality of Samtskhe was collapsing under external pressure. its western territories had already fallen under Ottoman administration, while the eastern part remained under local rule but depended on Iranian support. Ottoman raids devastated the region, forcing its ruler to seek aid from the Persian court, where he died soon afterward. His successor became a figurehead dominated by his powerful mother, whose political maneuvering included the elimination of rival nobles. Civil war spread throughout the region, destroying towns and weakening resistance. The death of the Persian ruler, who had previously supported Samtskhe, created further uncertainty. His successor showed little interest in Georgian affairs, encouraging Ottoman expansion. In 1578, a major Ottoman campaign moved through Georgian lands toward Iran. The Ottoman commander summoned Georgian rulers to support his expedition. Internal divisions within Samtskhe deepened as rival brothers chose opposing sides. Many nobles aligned themselves with the Ottomans, while others defended local independence. Ottoman forces captured fortresses, defeated opposing armies near Lake Childa, and executed large numbers of prisoners. Samtskhe was reorganized into Ottoman administrative districts, marking the effective end of its independence. The Ottoman advance continued toward eastern Georgia. Cities were abandoned as inhabitants fled into forests, where many were pursued and killed. Local rulers surrendered, and Ottoman authorities reorganized the region under military administration. Yet resistance persisted elsewhere. When Ottoman forces attempted to penetrate western Georgia, they suffered heavy losses in mountain passes, defended by local armies. Meanwhile, eastern Georgian rulers were drawn into complex alliances. Some accepted Ottoman authority in exchange for titles and privileges, while others sought support from Iran. The Persian ruler responded by installing a new king in Kartli, who agreed to convert to Islam and lead campaigns against Ottoman forces. Political loyalties shifted constantly, and former allies often became enemies. Amid this turmoil, one Georgian ruler dedicated himself to resisting Ottoman expansion through persistent warfare. Using guerrilla tactics and exploiting difficult terrain, he inflicted repeated losses on occupying forces. Ottoman armies faced shortages of food and supplies, while Georgian fighters launched ambushes in forests and mountain passes. Despite occasional defeats, resistance slowed Ottoman plans and prevented the complete conquest of the region. Internal divisions within Ottoman-aligned Georgian territories created further instability. Local leaders quarreled with imperial authorities, some renouncing their allegiance and returning to Christianity. Alliances shifted rapidly as rulers sought advantage in an environment defined by constant war. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire and Iran concluded a major treaty dividing the Caucasus into spheres of influence. Much of Georgia fell under Ottoman control, while eastern regions acknowledged Iranian authority. Although this arrangement temporarily reduced large-scale warfare, it intensified internal fragmentation and weakened prospects for reunification. Western Georgia descended once more into chaos. Rival rulers fought for control, supported alternately by Ottoman forces or regional allies. Young kings were placed on the throne and quickly deposed. Noble families competed for dominance, while foreign powers manipulated local disputes for their own purposes. Military campaigns devastated cities and populations were displaced. Efforts to restore unity repeatedly failed. One ambitious ruler attempted to bring Western territories under his control, capturing strategic cities and using artillery in civil conflict for the first time. Yet his own soldiers refused to pursue extreme measures against rival claimants, and divisions within his army forced him to abandon his plans. Regional leaders continued to act independently, and central authority remained weak. The fragmentation of Georgia continued as coastal regions submitted directly to Ottoman rule. Some local elites prospered through trade and the export of valuable resources, including slaves, while other regions suffered heavy taxation and economic decline. Ottoman administrative reforms imposed new systems of land registration and taxation, transforming once prosperous areas into impoverished provinces. Many villages were abandoned as peasants fled oppressive conditions. Amid widespread decline, one eastern kingdom experienced relative prosperity. Under stable leadership, agriculture flourished, trade expanded, and new buildings were constructed. Its ruler sought security through diplomacy with distant powers, particularly Russia. Negotiations were slow and uncertain, complicated by long journeys, language barriers, and mutual suspicion. Despite these difficulties, formal agreements were reached promising military cooperation and economic exchange. Russian interest in the region was driven by strategic and commercial concerns. They sought new trade routes for silk, alliances against common enemies, and access to military resources. Georgian rulers hoped for protection, modern weapons, and technical expertise. Yet practical cooperation proved difficult. Military expeditions failed, communication broke down, and both sides accused each other of misconduct. Meanwhile, powerful neighbouring empires viewed these diplomatic contacts with suspicion. The Persian ruler, alarmed by shifting alliances, demanded loyalty and took hostages to secure obedience. Tensions increased as Georgian leaders attempted to balance relations with multiple foreign powers. In the final years of the century, warfare resumed across the region. Local rulers launched campaigns against occupying forces, reclaiming cities through siege and surprise attack. Battles were fought in narrow valleys and mountain passes, where terrain often determined victory or defeat. One king, determined to resist foreign domination, personally led his troops into battle despite overwhelming odds. After fierce fighting, he was captured and taken into captivity abroad, where he spent his final years. His imprisonment became a symbol of Georgia's struggle for independence. Efforts to secure his release failed, despite diplomatic missions and financial payments. The political landscape remained unstable, with new rulers rising amid ongoing conflict. At the dawn of the 17th century, further upheavals struck the Eastern Kingdom that had once prospered. Internal disputes over succession led to violence within the royal family, including executions and political exile. Foreign powers intervened in these struggles, seeking influence through alliances, hostages, and military campaigns. The region once again became a battlefield between great empires. Professional armies equipped with modern firearms advanced into the Caucasus, capturing key cities and reshaping the balance of power. Georgian rulers were compelled to participate in these campaigns, often under threat or coercion. In 1605, Shah Abbas was consumed by the Ottoman threat and decided to let Alexandre II return to Kakheti. The release, however, did not mean trust. Alexandre was sent back under the watch of his own son, Constantine, a man shaped by years inside the Iranian system and likely expected to act as the Shah's eyes and knife if his father wavered. The moment they reached home, the orders were clear. Kakheti must field an army and strike Shirvan, an Ottoman-aligned frontier. And once the campaign was complete, Constantine would be installed there as governor. The pair arrived in Kakheti in March, and Constantine pushed for an immediate march. Alexandre resisted, stalling deliberately. He doubted the campaign would succeed, and he still clung to a faint hope that a Russian force might break through the Caucasus and tilt the balance. The delay did not last long. One morning, just before Alexandre planned to receive foreign envoys at court, Constantine stormed into the royal quarters. With a group of Iranian officers, he demanded a war council at once accusing both his father and his brother, Giorgi, of hesitation and weakness. The confrontation turned into a spectacle of panic and rage. Constantine drew his sword and killed Giorgi on the spot. Alexandre tried to intervene, but he too was cut down in the chaos, along with senior churchmen and several nobles caught in the room. Fighting erupted beyond the chambers as factions collided through the palace and surrounding compounds. The outside envoys who witnessed the aftermath would later claim that hundreds more died before the violence subsided. Constantine understood what proof of loyalty the Shah demanded. He ordered the severed heads of his father and brother sent east as a message to Iran, while their bodies were placed in burial at Alaverdi, an attempt to preserve a minimum of royal dignity after a massacre. Before the foreign visitors could even depart, Constantine tried to justify himself. He insisted he had acted in self-defense, claiming he had been marked for death and forced into an impossible choice. He spoke of family history as if it were destiny, as if the pattern of father against son had simply repeated itself. He also blamed the path that had brought him to this point, the years in Iran that had torn him from his faith and left him trapped between fear of God and fear of the Shah. People close to the Iranian court later described him as torn apart by anxiety in the hours before the murders, caught between the terror of punishment for refusing and the terror of punishment for obeying. The new ruler in Kakhetiya refused to bind himself to Russia. The foreign envoys who had hoped to secure an oath of allegiance were dismissed and moved on toward Kartli, expecting better results there. They found the same evasions. Kartli's king, Giorgi X, cited imminent war and refused to commit. The envoys began looking for alternative dynastic matches and relatives who might fit Moscow's expectations, weighing candidates like merchants weigh goods. Some were unavailable, held far away as hostages inside Iran. Others did not impress the envoys enough to justify the risks. Giorgi VI blocked proposals and even recalled his own delegation before it could leave Georgian territory, terrified of provoking Shah Abbas. Kartli's ruler had benefited from Abbas's campaigns in the region and had accepted land and favours from Iran in exchange for local concessions. He had no intention of gambling that relationship on Russian promises. When the envoys finally reached Moscow, the world they expected had already collapsed. Boris was dead, and a pretender sat on the throne. The next Russian representative sent south was killed by bandits on the river routes. Russian diplomacy disintegrated in confusion, leaving Kartli and Kakhetiya exposed to a Shah who was growing harsher and more suspicious with every year. After Alexandre's murder, eastern Georgia spiraled into open breakdown. Russia effectively vanished from the scene in the same year when the Russian commander Butelin and his army were destroyed in Dagestan by the Shamkal's forces, assisted by Turkish allies. The idea of a strong northern protector now looked like a mirage that had lured Georgia into deeper danger. In Kakhetiya, the vacuum of power became deadly. Ketavan, the widow of King David, was driven by a single purpose: survival of her line and restoration of order. After one failed attempt to revive Russian support through a futile mission, she moved to eliminate the parricidal Constantine. At that moment, Constantine was far from home, leading a combined Iranian and Kakhetian force against Shirvan under the Shah's command, facing stiff resistance around Shamakha. In the dead of night, rebels burst into his tent. Constantine fought his way out, while Ottoman troops pressed the chaos, and he escaped toward Ardabil to beg Abbas for help. Within weeks, he returned with fresh forces, but the rebellion had hardened. Kakhetians, supported by Kartlians, met him near Belakhnist-Skali and killed him. His rise had been swift, and his end was brutal, the kind of ending the region had begun to recognize as normal. Shah Abbas then turned back to the wider war. He defeated an Ottoman army near Lake Urmai, and in 1606 gathered new forces in Karabakh, moving to tighten control over the Caucasus. Ketevan approached him with a request that sounded obedient, confirmation of her 16-year-old son, Teymuraz, as king. Abbas agreed, seeing a young ruler as manageable. Teymuraz was blessed and formally recognized, while nobody at the Iranian court fully grasped how stubborn and unpredictable he would become. Ketevan worked quickly to strengthen his position through marriage, pairing Teymuraz with Anna, the daughter of Mamiya Gurieli. For a short time, the marriage brought genuine happiness, perhaps the only calm Teymuraz would know before the storm returned. Abbas's attention shifted toward Kartli. He wanted no second Kakhetiya, no eastern kingdom drifting toward Russian influence. That same year, Giorgi X died suddenly, at a summer residence in a freak incident that became legend. Abbas advanced, cleared key fortresses of Ottoman garrisons, forced the Tibilisi defenders to surrender, and installed his own governor in the capital. Kartli's nobles pleaded for their 14-year-old king, Luarsab, to be confirmed. Abbas agreed again, judging another teenager to be pliable. Both Teymuraz and Luarsab were treated like pieces that could be moved on a board. Teymuraz did not behave like a pawn. He soon refused to send Kakhetian forces to help Abbas crush resistance in Shirvan. His mother, still at the Iranian court, offered her own guards in a show of loyalty, but Abbas refused. In contrast, Luarsab earned temporary favour in 1608 by striking Ottoman forces in Samtskhe. The campaign was tied to the hopes of an older woman with deep claims in that region, a widow from the last local ruling line, who had survived for decades in hiding and now believed that Iranian backing might restore her family's position. The Shah offered shelter and polite attention, but little real assistance. Luarsab's troops briefly reclaimed Akaltsike, then were forced to withdraw. Ottoman authorities responded by installing a Muslim Georgian commander over Samtskhe and preparing retaliation. The punishment came fast. In June 1609, Crimean Tatars were sent into southern Kartli, raiders in skins and armour who moved like a plague. They nearly caught Luarsab at his summer residence. A captured priest was forced to guide them, but deliberately misled them and paid with his life. Luarsab rallied and, alongside Giorgi Sarkadze, the formidable governor of Tibilisi, pushed the invaders back despite heavy losses. The Tatars tried to escape across the Kura with improvised bridges, only to be met again. Sarkadze's cavalry crossed the river and met blades with gunfire at Tashiskari, a moment that showed how the region's warfare was changing. Prisoners and severed heads were sent to Abbas as trophies, proof that Luarsab could fight. The Shah was impressed enough to pull his garrison out of Tbilisi and allow Luarsab to rule with fewer restraints, at least for the moment. In 1610, Abbas invited Teymuraz and Luarsab to join him for a summer of hunting, a ritual that mixed hospitality with surveillance. Teymuraz, now the father of two sons, seemed at that stage more interested in feasting than strategy. Abbas took Luarsab's sister Tinatin into his harem, tightening family ties the way he tightened chains. Yet relations soured quickly, especially in Kartli, as Luarsab began listening to Sarkadze's advice. Sarkadze was older, sharper, and driven by a vision of centralized rule, economic recovery, and eventual reunification. He built a political bloc from dependent followers and lesser nobles, unsettling the old aristocratic families. When Luarsab married Sarkadze's sister, Makrine, the court panicked. Rival nobles convinced the king that Sarkadze served Iran. Luarsab divorced Makrine and authorized Sarkadze's murder. Sakadze escaped at the last moment after being warned by a guilty conspirator, who was mutilated for it. Sakadze fled east and rebuilt his career inside the Iranian system, rising high enough to act as a guardian to the Shah's heir. Abbas did not forget what he considered Kartli's ingratitude. Warsab's vulnerability increased. At the same time, tragedy struck Kakhetiya. Queen Anna developed a fatal illness. For weeks she could barely swallow, and the attempts to save her failed. Teimuraz was devastated and poured gifts into the church to secure prayers for her soul. Abbas responded not with sympathy, but with fury. When Teimuraz refused to join another summer hunt, Abbas pressed him toward a new marriage designed to bind the two Georgian kings into his family. Teimuraz was ordered to marry Luarsab's elder sister Khorassan, even though Georgian religious rules treated such unions as forbidden. Under pressure, the marriage went ahead. Both kings became Abbas's brothers-in-law, bound to him by blood and fear. The Shah's anxiety grew into something darker. The two kings, alarmed by the influence of Iranian-aligned nobles, began demoting and even executing men seen as too close to Iran. Abbas's court contained many Georgians. Georgian commanders governed provinces and led armies, proving that loyalty could be rewarded. But suspicion was never satisfied. Abbas began imagining the Caucasus as a frontier that had to be emptied and refilled. In his mind, Christian Kartli and Kakhetiya were obstacles to be uprooted and replaced with Turkic settlers, a living wall against any Russian return. Meanwhile, the Western kingdoms followed a different logic. In Imeretiya, after the death of a childless ruler in 1605, Kutaisi's nobles crowned Giorgi III, who at first stabilized the region. Western leaders believed their best chance against Ottoman pressure lay in Iranian support, even while eastern Georgia resisted Iranian control. Guria's ruler leaned on family alliances, including his daughter's marriage to Teimuraz, to seek protection. He cooperated with Mingrelia's ruler and even managed to retake Ajaria from Ottoman hands. Yet Iranian power did not reliably reach the western coast, and the promised military help never truly arrived. Against the Ottomans, Western rulers turned to a dangerous alternative: Cossack raiders, who sometimes struck Ottoman ports across the Black Sea. These fighters could harass the Turks, but they were just as capable of looting local Christians as they were of fighting Islam's empires. In Mingrelia, a young ruler came to power after a hunting accident killed his predecessor. He had been raised in Kakhetia's royal environment, but his temperament pulled the West back toward disorder. All across Georgia, the hunting field seemed to deliver deaths that changed politics as violently as battles did. By late 1613, Abbas staged a performance of peace, assuring Ottoman envoys that a truce still mattered. Then he pivoted. In spring, he demanded Teimuraz's sons as hostages. Teimuraz, cornered, sent his mother, Ketevan, and his younger son, Alexandre, to Iran first, hoping to buy time. Abbas demanded more. The heir, Levan, was taken as well. Then Abbas demanded Teimuraz himself. At that point, the situation snapped into war. Kakhetiya had almost no time to prepare. On 21st March 1614, two Iranian armies entered from different directions, one moving through familiar routes in Kartli, another descending from Shirvan. Many surrendered or fled rather than fight. Teimuraz's authority was fragile, and some distrusted him deeply, especially after the killing of a celebrated defender whose popularity had outshone the king. Teimuraz's forces pulled back through the mountains into Kartli, and Luarsab joined the retreat. Both kings sought refuge in Imeretiya, hoping the west could shelter them. Abbas occupied Kakhetiya's capital, stripped treasures, and transformed symbols of Georgian identity into symbols of conquest. People were deported in vast numbers, marched into Iran to become farmers and labourers in the interior. New settlers from neighbouring Muslim regions were brought into emptied lands. For weeks, the countryside was plundered. Abbas installed puppet rule, empowering local collaborators while keeping ultimate control in Iranian hands. Then, he turned his pressure westward. He occupied key fortresses in Kartli and threatened Imeretiya with devastation if the fugitive kings were not surrendered. Western rulers met and answered with defiance, insisting they would not deliver their guests. Yet fear of provoking a larger war with the Ottomans made them cautious. Gifts and conciliatory messages were sent, trying to delay invasion by turning politics into ceremony. Luarsab believed he could still save Kartli by sacrifice. In October 1614, he surrendered himself to Abbas, hoping Kartli would escape Kakitiya's fate. For a time, it seemed possible. Abbas treated him with outward courtesy, moving him from city to camp, even taking him hunting. Then, news arrived that both Luarsab and Teymuraz had sought Ottoman support if war broke out. Abbas's patience ended. Luarsab was ordered to accept Islam. He refused and was cast into a harsh prison far from home. War between Iran and the Ottomans did flare in 1615, and Teymuraz tried to seize the opening. Agents were sent into Kakitiya to exploit hatred of occupation. A revolt erupted during a major church festival when armed men entered as if pilgrims and slaughtered the Iranian garrison. Teymuraz crossed into the region with a small western force and linked up with rebels at the border. Fighting spread rapidly. The plan depended on the Ottomans invading to distract Abbas, but the Ottoman army delayed. Abbas, therefore, had enough troops to crush the uprising. An Iranian general moved to cut off Teymuraz's escape. The Shah's own Georgian soldiers leaked the plan, and Teymuraz struck first, launching a surprise assault that routed the camp and drowned many fleeing soldiers in the rivers. Loot flooded into Georgian hands so heavily that prices collapsed in the aftermath. Yet the victory brought no rescue. No great ally arrived. Abbas responded by mobilizing not only his vassals, but also northern raiders for a punitive campaign. Kaketiya's people fled into forests, built makeshift defences and destroyed crossings. But the invaders turned the land into emptiness. Abbas installed a puppet king in Kartli and unleashed what felt like a deliberate program of terror to punish defiance and reshape the region's population. Teymuraz and his closest allies escaped west, again before the roads were sealed. For a short time, Abbas was dragged south by renewed Ottoman pressure. But the pause did not save Kaketiya. A new truce stabilized the frontier, freeing Abbas to return. Refugees who tried to come home through winter snows collided with Iranian patrols. Thousands more were deported or enslaved. Whole districts were partitioned and attached to Iranian provinces. Herds grazed where villages had been. The kingdom that had once been crowded and prosperous now had only a fraction of its people left. Kartli, weakened under a puppet regime that held only part of the country, submitted outwardly. Georgian officials inside the Iranian system attempted to calm the nobility and prevent total devastation. In some places, they succeeded in saving communities from deportation, a small mercy in a landscape of collapse. In the west, Ottoman pressure took a different form. Ports were blockaded to starve the interior of salt and iron. Envoys sent to plead for relief were imprisoned. Eventually a deal was reached. Tribute would be paid, and in return embargoes would be eased. Taxes, cloth payments, and deliveries of young men and women as slaves became routine burdens. Local rulers were allowed to forbid armed Ottoman parties from entering, a concession that looked like autonomy but still rested on fear. Western rivals temporarily set aside disputes, but even there, the region could not rely on outside help. Cossacks raided Ottoman shores and sometimes appeared as potential allies, yet their reputation for looting made them dangerous guests. Teimuraz, desperate, even stepped onto Ottoman soil in 1618 to secure promises of restoration. He committed his displaced followers to Ottoman plans and then watched those promises evaporate under a fresh Ottoman-Iranian agreement that revived an older partition of influence. He then tried Russia again, sending appeals in the belief that a northern protector might still exist. Russia responded awkwardly and provocatively, angering Abbas by demanding the restoration of Teimuraz and Luarsab. The Shah interpreted this as proof that Georgia was a permanent doorway for foreign intrusion. Over the next years, Abbas's punishment became personal and systematic. Teimuraz's sons were mutilated and destroyed. Luarsab was killed in captivity. Women connected to the Georgian courts were reshuffled as instruments of humiliation and control. The Shah's fury reached its most infamous target in Queen Ketevan. Given an ultimatum to abandon her faith, she refused, and she was executed after prolonged torture in 1624. The remains that could be recovered were carried back for burial, turning her death into a symbol of resistance and loss. Even those who served Abbas faithfully could not feel safe. He summoned Georgian leaders, seized their relatives as hostages, and forced alliances through marriage politics that pulled nobles into traps. Saakadze, now a major figure inside Iran's structure, forged alliances with powerful Georgian dukes, promising to rescue royal women from forced marriages and to rebuild a political front. Teimuraz, however, feared being outmaneuvered by his own allies. To keep a key duke closer to him than to Saakadze, he married the man to his own young daughter, overruling objections and showing how deeply the struggle had warped the moral order of the Georgian courts. Shah Abbas entered Kartli at the start of 1625, determined to end the Georgian question on his own terms. He arrived with a spectacle meant to look like celebration rather than conquest. A grand wedding procession filled with high-ranking commanders and a royal bride meant for the Iranian-backed ruler of Kartli. The message was theatre, but the purpose was control. Abbas positioned his forces around Mukhrani, close enough to strike Kakhetiya at once if resistance flared. Reports from his governors warned him that a new uprising was brewing, and he decided to move first. The trap was set with bureaucratic calm. Iranian commanders summoned Kakhetian levies under the pretext of a campaign elsewhere, then informed them that Christians could not be trusted to fight other Christians. They were ordered to hand over their weapons and disperse. After that came the final step. Gifts were promised, and small groups were guided toward an execution area as if they were being escorted to a ceremony. Panic broke the plan. Men fled in every direction, and the illusion of order collapsed into chaos. At the heart of the turning point stood Giorgi Saakadze. He had kept his true intentions hidden, but he intercepted a courier carrying Abbas's instructions to eliminate any armed Kartlians as well, including Saakadze himself. The discovery changed everything. Saakadze exposed the plan and used it to unite Kartli and Kakhetiya behind a single urgent goal: survival. He then fed the Iranian commander advice designed to sound loyal, but to weaken the enemy. The huge army was encouraged to split into smaller detachments and push deeper into Kakhetiya. Once scattered, those detachments could be isolated, surrounded, and destroyed. The result was a shock that few in the region believed possible. Saakadze led an assault that crushed the Iranian headquarters, and Georgian forces surged forward with a speed that turned surprise into massacre. At Marcopi, east of Tibilisi, a large Iranian army was shattered. weapons and supplies fell into Georgian hands. The citadel of Tbilisi was pressed before the Iranian-appointed king could even reach the city. Iranian commanders retreated in different directions, and within days, Kartli and Kakhetiya were effectively back under Georgian control. Only the garrison inside Tbilisi continued to resist, cut off from water and surrounded. Teimuraz, who had been preparing to leave by sea and gamble everything on distant protection, abruptly reversed course. He raced east, reclaimed the throne in Kakhetiya, and then presented himself as ruler of both kingdoms. Abbas and his chroniclers reacted with disbelief and fury. The defeat was not just military, it was humiliating. It showed that the empire's grip, built through hostages and puppet kings, could still snap. Abbas answered with terror. He executed Sarkadz's son, held in Iran, and sent the severed head as a warning meant to break Sarkadz's will. Sarkadze responded in kind, sending trophies back toward the Shah while reaching outward for allies. Messages and envoys were dispatched to the Ottomans, along with captured soldiers offered as proof that Georgia could be useful. Yet the Ottoman leadership refused to commit. Their priorities lay elsewhere, and a Georgian uprising, however dramatic, was not enough to pull them off their central campaigns. The counterblow arrived in June 1625. Abbas mobilized a massive force under trusted governors and commanders, including a Georgian-born prince raised within Iran's system, a man who would later become central to Iranian policy in Kartli. The army camped at Marabda in the Algeti Valley, southeast of Tbilisi, while Georgian forces took position in the higher ground of the Kojori Gorge. Sarkadze urged the council to stay in the narrow terrain, where a larger army could not deploy properly and where ambush and controlled fire could equalize numbers. He was overruled. Teimuraz, senior nobles, and church leaders pushed for an open battle in the plain, convinced that decisive action would prevent the Iranians from fully assembling. Marabda proved how costly pride could be. The Iranian army employed disciplined musket formations and field artillery, and the Georgian cavalry charge ran into a wall of coordinated fire. Courage and close quarters fighting allowed Georgian fighters to break through in places, and the wounding of a major Iranian commander caused visible confusion in the enemy ranks. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. Looting began, prisoners were taken, and pockets of Iranian troops were driven back. Then a fresh contingent arrived late, struck the exhausted Georgians, and reversed the tide. Georgian cavalry withdrew to the heights, but the infantry, men without the mobility to escape, was cut down in terrible numbers. The battle was remembered as triumph and disaster at the same time, an achievement that bled the country dry. Thousands of Georgian soldiers and many key leaders were lost. After Marabda, the war shifted. Direct confrontation gave way to raids, sabotage, and guerrilla fighting aimed at protecting towns and blocking supply lines. Iranian forces attempted a rescue mission into the mountains to recover high-value prisoners. Sarkadze intercepted that expedition and destroyed it almost completely. Yet one major figure escaped with captives back to the main army. Georgia could win battles and still lose the wider struggle. Iran adjusted its strategy. Rather than trying to cleanse the region of Christians by force, the Shah leaned on bribery, appointments, and local rivalry. Certain princes were promoted over others. Lower Kartli was placed under commanders who owed everything to Iran. Clerics were pressured to legitimize the Iranian-backed king. Abbas had lost too many troops to rule directly with garrisons everywhere, so he accepted a system of controlled vassalage. It was not the total solution he had wanted, but it was a workable one. Sarkadze, threatened by both Iran and rival Georgian elites, sought refuge in Samtskhe, where Ottoman authority still had footholds. Local rulers there, disappointed by Iranian promises, flirted with rebellion and offered Sakkadze space to regroup. Envoys travelled to Istanbul, hoping the Sultan would seize the opportunity. The response was cautious and vague. Support was permitted in limited form, but no full Ottoman intervention followed. The empire had larger targets in mind, and Georgia remained a secondary theatre. While the east burned, Western Georgia was tearing itself apart for reasons that had little to do with grand strategy and everything to do with rivalry, status, and humiliation. A dynastic marriage in Imeretiya collapsed into scandal. Accusations of adultery, real or invented, triggered alliances and counter-alliances across Guria, Mingrelia, and Abkhazia. One ruler used the outrage to build a coalition through marriages, while another tried to hold the kingdom together as coastal principalities, tightened blockades and cut off supplies. Kutaisi and the interior suffered hunger, not because harvests failed, but because rival princes wanted leverage. Mingrelia's ruler moved with ruthless efficiency. He struck Imeretiya, exiled the king, captured noblemen, and introduced a practice that turned war into business. Prisoners were no longer just enemies to be eliminated, but assets to be ransomed. That alone changed the logic of conflict. Raids became profitable. Captives became currency. Every feud promised income, and peace promised nothing. Even alliances in the west rotted from inside. A marriage meant to bind Mingrelia to Abkhazia collapsed into accusation and mutilation. Revenge followed, then more scandal. Abductions, public outrage, threats of civil war narrowly avoided by death and fear. When conspiracies rose, the ruler survived assassination attempts and responded with brutal punishment, blinding his own brother, confiscating estates, executing rivals in ways designed to terrify anyone thinking of disobedience. Guria fell under Mingrelian control through a mixture of force and manipulation. A prince was captured and blinded, then later released to live out his life as a monk, far from the politics that had destroyed him. A church leader was installed as a pliable ruler. Mingrelia's ruler expanded his titles and demanded recognition beyond his borders. Yet stone walls and the lack of heavy artillery still limited the extent of domination. To defend against raids from the mountains and coastal enemies, a long wall was built with watchtowers and musketeers, mobilizing labor on a scale that strained society but hardened control. The Ottomans watched this chaos with satisfaction. A divided West could not field the massive cavalry forces that had once threatened Ottoman interests. Deals were offered for iron and tribute. The price was paid in goods, in livestock products, and in human beings. Slavery and taxation became routine, and the region's poverty deepened. Meanwhile, Mingrelia's interior remained relatively rich, where foreign collectors rarely ventured, creating a sharp contrast between the taxed coast and the sheltered valleys. In the middle of this wreckage, Teimuraz searched for an impossible rescue. He no longer expected decisive help from either the Ottomans or Russia. Influenced by foreign clerics and travellers who understood European politics better than Georgian nobles could, he began to imagine a new kind of gamble, stirring European powers into a wider war that might distract or break the empires, strangling Georgia. Georgian dissidents inside Iran, men with command posts and provincial authority, seemed to offer leverage. Teimuraz also believed that Persia's struggle over key maritime trade routes might tempt Europeans into action. An embassy was sent west. The message was bold, almost reckless. Georgia was presented as a major Christian force, ready to march toward the heart of the Ottoman world, ready to help seize strategic ports, ready to place itself under a broader Christian coalition. The numbers promised were inflated. The religious posture was blurred for political effect, and the target was left conveniently vague. Ottomans, Iran, or both, depending on what listeners wanted to hear. It was a diplomatic performance aimed at survival. In Europe, the envoy was received politely, even rewarded, but the response was delay rather than commitment. Councils asked for assessments, for reports, for time. In Rome, officials quickly understood that Teimuraz had not abandoned his own church tradition, and enthusiasm cooled. Interest survived mostly among missionary organizations, which focused less on armies and more on printing, language, and religious outreach. A small cultural spark emerged from that work, but it did not translate into the military lifeline Teimuraz needed. Back in Georgia, the struggle returned to its most damaging form: Georgian against Georgian. In early 1626, Teimuraz and Sakkadze pushed Iranian garrisons back and restored control over much of Kartli and Kakheti. Their support came from lesser nobles and ordinary gentry, rather than the old great families. Their success made the Iranian puppet king's authority shrink to little more than the area around Tibilisi. Yet Sakkadze's ambition now collided with Teimuraz's claim. Sakkadze believed Teimuraz could never unite all Georgia and began courting Western rulers, suggesting a different dynastic future. Betrothals were arranged, letters exchanged, promises sworn. Some nobles rallied to Sakkadze's vision of a stronger monarchy. Others saw him as dangerous, arrogant, and unstoppable. The conflict became inevitable. At Basileti in late 1626, Teimuraz defeated Sakkadze in a civil war that shattered the brief unity created at Marcopi. Sakkadze fled into Ottoman territory. For a time he hoped the Sultan would use him as a weapon against Iran and against rival Georgians. He adopted Islam again to fit Ottoman expectations and was granted a governorship, but his habits and his independence bred suspicion. In 1629, Ottoman authorities ordered his execution. Sakkadze, his son, and dozens of followers were slaughtered under a convenient pretext, eliminating a man who had become too unpredictable for any empire to trust. By the time Teimuraz's European envoy returned, everything had changed. The embassy's promises and strategies no longer matched the reality on the ground. Sakkadze was dead. Shah Abbas was dead. A new Shah ruled through men shaped by the old system, and an Iranian-backed king remained in Tibilisi. Georgian factions inside Iran that might once have helped were being purged, exiled, or silenced. The window for the grand European plan had closed before it ever truly opened. Teimuraz, emboldened by victory over Sakkadze, tried to stabilize what remained. Kartli was informally split between his own sphere and the Iranian-backed court in Tibilisi. He secured formal recognition for Kakheti as a vassal kingdom, then looked for ways to remove the Iranian nominee without triggering total annihilation. He began to suspect his own allies of plotting for thrones. In 1630, a murder was arranged in the Iranian-backed court, followed by the abduction of the queen. A line was not crossed. The captive was treated cautiously, because harming her risked direct retaliation from Iran. Teimuraz then moved quickly to eliminate the partner who could expose his role in the conspiracy. He executed the man and sent the severed head to the new Shah as proof of loyalty, presenting himself as a ruler who punished treachery rather than committing it. The move served several goals at once. It removed a rival, soothed Iran, and opened a marriage path meant to bind Teimuraz to Western royalty. Yet the deeper danger was rising elsewhere. A Georgian prince raised within Iran's elite circle was positioning himself as the more reliable choice to govern Georgia on Iran's behalf. He persuaded the Shah to redirect the Kakhetian crown away from Teimuraz and toward himself, setting the stage for a new era. A brief campaign followed, marked by raids into frontier districts and a failed hope that Armenian support would turn into a massive liberation force. It never did. Iran responded with executions and demands. If Teimuraz wanted pardon, he had to surrender his allies. He refused, smuggled them into Ottoman lands, and accepted that he had just declared war on the new order. The consequence was predictable. Iran installed its chosen ruler in Kartli, while Kakhetiya was seized by another Iranian-backed claimant, with a large army that included Georgian troops fighting for the Shah. Teimuraz found himself stranded, short on resources with enemies closing in. He negotiated with missionaries not for doctrine, but for money, cash to buy weapons and keep a remnant army alive. Refuge in the west looked uncertain. Mingrelian raids made Imeretiya unstable, and Iranian cavalry attempted to intercept him. Still, in early 1633, Teimuraz escaped. The new Iranian-backed ruler in Kartli understood that legitimacy in Georgia could not be built solely on fear. He presented himself as a Muslim king who would protect local Christianity from harsher intervention, a buffer between Isfahan and the Georgian Church. His birth and age made him an unlikely unifier, and he lacked a direct heir, but he possessed experience, discipline, and a talent for diplomacy. He rebuilt fortresses, imposed submission on resistant nobles, replaced foreign troops with less offensive garrisons, and recalled exiles who had lived for years in Iran. Agriculture resumed. Order returned. Kartli, after decades of devastation, began to breathe again. A marriage alliance with Mingrelia strengthened this ruler's position and tightened Iran's influence along Georgia's western frontier. The match was celebrated with lavish gifts from Iran and large payments to Mingrelia's ruler. Money meant to keep Western leaders aligned and to discourage any new turn toward Russia. That alliance also had a military edge. It was intended to enable pressure on Imeretiya. Battles followed on the roads and bridges of the west. Imeretiya's king was defeated and captured in 1634 at a crossing that entered Georgian memory as a warning about traps and misjudged terrain. Mingrelia grew richer from Iranian subsidies, and the balance of power in western Georgia tilted further away from Kutaisi. Teimuraz tried again, returning through the mountains to gather supporters. He was pushed out. He offered peace. He even sent his daughter to marry into the Iranian court. And for a moment that seemed to buy him recognition and gifts, even restoration in Kakhetiya under conditions of obedience. Yet Teimuraz could not stop himself from trying to overturn Kartli's new regime. Between 1636 and 1642, he launched repeated attempts, including one assassination effort, and again sought Russian support by oath and petition. The promised aid never came. Another Ottoman-Iranian truce stabilized the frontier and froze Georgia's division, shutting the main door Teimuraz had hoped to use. The truce hardened into a long reality. Imeretiya remained in the Ottoman sphere, Kartli and Kakhetiya in Iran's. Imeretiya was battered by Mingrelian raids and blockades, and could not help Teimuraz even when family ties demanded it. Samtskhe, under Ottoman consolidation, became a closed zone for him as well. Taxes deepened, churches declined, conversions increased, and yet the province experienced a kind of grim stability compared to the anarchy of western Georgia. People could travel, trade, and visit relatives across borders, in ways that wartime would have made impossible. The empire was harsh, but it could also be predictable, and that predictability sometimes felt like relief. Teimuraz still plotted. In 1642, a conspiracy formed to kill Kartli's ruler during a relaxed moment away from guards. The plot was betrayed. The king barricaded himself, and the conspirators were hunted down. Some were blinded. A church leader implicated in the plan was imprisoned and killed. Iran's court sent a new governor into Kakheti with orders to destroy Teimuraz. But Teimuraz's household, women who understood politics as well as any warrior, intervened and clemency was granted. A blood payment was imposed for earlier crimes. Teimuraz rejected the verdict, seized back villages and expelled officials. War resumed. This time there was no recovery. Teimuraz was decisively defeated. His last surviving son was killed. The nobility abandoned him and even offered to deliver him to his enemies. His queen begged for asylum in a monastery. The ruling court consulted Iran. Then, unexpectedly, a different choice was made. Whether from genuine chivalry, a desire to avoid creating a martyr, or a cold calculation that exile was safer than execution. Teimuraz and his queen were granted transport, animals, and an escort into Imeretiya. Many Kakhetians chose to follow them into exile. When Teimuraz finally reached Kutaisi, he tried to turn exile into strategy. He pressed King Alexandre to adopt Teimuraz's own grandson, a boy named Giorgi, so that the child would stand to inherit both lines of kingship and, in theory, bind Kakhetia's broken cause to Imeretiya's fragile throne. It was a political rescue plan disguised as family duty. Teimuraz also aimed at something even harder, ending the long, grinding feud between Imeretiya and Mingrelia that had drained the West for a generation. He went in person to Zugdidi, hoping that face-to-face negotiation could achieve what armies and insults never had. Levan Dadiani of Mingrelia did not soften. His power rested on keeping Imeretiya weak, and he had already shown how far he would go to make that weakness permanent. Years earlier, he had captured Alexandre's father and demanded a ransom that stripped Imeretiya of much of its precious metal, and handed over a critical stretch of territory along a riverbank that guarded access routes. The bargain left Imeretiya exposed, its frontier thinned, its defences compromised. Levan then attacked the economy more quietly, but just as effectively, by relocating merchants and craftsmen, including Jewish and Armenian trading networks, into Mingrelian lands. The message was unmistakable. Wealth, markets, and supply lines would flow through Zugdidi, not Kutaisi. Imeretiya nearly slid into outright takeover by a rival Western prince, and only the nobles' fear of annexation forced a hurried decision. While King Giorgi still languished as a prisoner, the aristocracy elevated the heir Alexandre to keep the state from dissolving. Even Levan Dadiani began to feel pressure, though not from Imeretiya alone. Ottoman officials watched Mingrelia's shifting friendships with suspicion, especially as rumours spread about Iranian contacts and sea raiders operating along the Black Sea coast. Ottoman troops appeared at a coastal river mouth, looted a monastery, and reminded everyone that Istanbul could still reach into the region when it chose. Levan pledged obedience and tribute, yet soon refused Ottoman demands to support an invasion far from his own borders, calculating that compliance would only invite more orders. Like Teimuraz, Levan Dadiani also tried the Russian option, but his attempt became a lesson in how distant promises could collapse in the mountains. His envoy, a priest named Gabriel Gejanava, was held for years at a frontier river by Russian authorities before being allowed deeper into their territory. When he finally arrived, his exaggerated praise and constant flattery did not win the reaction he expected. Russian officials treated him coolly, and that chill was likely sharpened by Teimuraz's own warnings that some Western rulers were as predatory toward fellow Georgians as they were defiant toward outsiders. When Geganava returned with Russian emissaries and a draft oath of loyalty, Levan stalled again, using mourning as a shield, delaying audiences for months. The Russians were shown churches and new religious foundations, and they were guided through monuments and icon treasuries, meant to project devotion and legitimacy. The visitors could admire the workmanship, but they could not read the quiet boasting that sometimes accompanied such gifts. Nor could they measure the human suffering that had paid for so much silver and gold. Levin's personality confounded nearly every foreign observer who met him. He could be sincerely religious and dramatically generous to distant holy places, granting land and households to support shrines far beyond Georgia. At the same time, he could be aggressively transactional, demanding large sums for ecclesiastical appointments, treating offices as assets to be sold. He could be clever in dealing with Ottoman demands, sometimes leading Turkish detachments through the poorest villages so that their foraging and looting would yield little, discouraging them from returning. He could be terrifyingly cruel in domestic rule, using mutilation and torture as routine political tools, and imposing violent ordeals as methods of judgment. Yet he also encouraged settlement by merchants, welcomed skilled craftsmen, cultivated foreign missionaries who brought medical knowledge, and devoted himself to exhausting administrative detail, presenting himself as a ruler who never stopped working. The society beneath him was no gentler. Reports circulated of nobles trading family members for horses, or seizing priests to sell into slavery to finance weddings. Even seasoned travellers, men who had seen Ottoman prisons and Persian courts, described Mingrelia as a place where brutality had become normal, and virtue seemed like a dangerous eccentricity. In Imeratia, Alexandre's reign hardened under pressure. When his father died, Alexandre found himself facing a Mingrelian ruler who had now acquired artillery and foreign expertise. Levan Dadiani forced a captured gunsmith to cast cannon, then used those weapons to breach walls that Alexandre had believed would protect him not only against external enemies, but also against his own fickle nobles. Kutaisi's defences, once considered the last guarantee of royal survival, proved vulnerable. Villages burned, captives were taken, and screams carried across valleys as prisoners were driven away. Resistance formed around Alexandre's brother, Mamuka, but he was captured and chained. Even when Teimuraz intervened later, Alexandre was compelled to surrender hostages, including his own son from an earlier marriage, in exchange for a temporary easing of pressure. Those hostages remained prisoners for years, living proof that Mingrelia could reach into the royal house whenever it wished. Then, Teimuraz's carefully laid dynastic bridge collapsed. The boy, Giorgi, meant to inherit both thrones and unite claims by blood, died in infancy. The loss destroyed the simplest path Teimuraz had imagined, and it pushed both Teimuraz and Alexandre back toward the last remaining hope they could still speak aloud: Russian protection. Alexandre wrote as if submission could purchase survival, describing his kingdom as a near neighbour of lands Russia already influenced, and promising loyalty without end. Teimuraz asked for mediation with Iran's court, hoping that a great Christian monarch might restrain Persian governors and reduce pressure on Georgian churches and communities. The reality was the opposite. While the kings waited for distant answers, Mingrelian cannon again battered the region, reducing major sites to rubble and capturing nobles and soldiers. Hostages multiplied. Mamuksa was blinded and died not long after. Alexandre appealed to Kartli's ruler, Rostom, reminding him that Mamuka had once been considered as a successor in Kartli. Rostom, with his queen's consent, denounced Mingrelia's actions with ceremonial curses. But curses did not move artillery. When the joint embassy finally reached Moscow, the Georgian kings asked for a scale of help that Russia could not or would not provide. One demanded thousands of armed men, dynastic marriages, money for reconquest, and direct diplomatic pressure on Iran. The other asked for Cossacks to break Mingrelia's grip and punish its ruler for dealings with the Ottomans. Both offered vassalage, describing their crowns and people as belonging to the Tsar. Russia responded cautiously. The envoys who eventually arrived brought no troops, partly out of fear that marching armed bands into the Caucasus would provoke Ottoman retaliation and ignite a broader war. They carried forms for oaths instead, along with instructions to observe the country, note resources, and evaluate holy sites and mineral wealth. The mission became as much an inspection as an alliance. Alexandre welcomed the Russians with ceremony and feasts, then delayed again, hesitating to bind himself to a distant power that might abandon him at the first Ottoman complaint. Russian emissaries used gifts and bribes to push the process forward, rewarding influential clerics and nobles so that they would pressure the king. Eventually, the oath was signed, at least on paper, but the signature did not change the physics of power in western Georgia. Mingrelian envoys even approached the Russians with their own requests, seeking Cossacks for protection, turning diplomacy into yet another arena of rivalry. When the Russians finally departed through the mountain passes, they took with them Georgian representatives and a political situation that was now more fragmented than before. Imeretia's nobility split into competing factions, some looking north to Russia, some looking east to Iran, others leaning toward the Ottomans simply because Ottoman garrisons were closer than Russian armies. Teimuraz made one more bitter gamble by sending his grandson Erekle north into a long Russian exile, hoping that a Georgian prince at the Tsar's court might become a living petition that could not be ignored. Highland delegations also appeared in Moscow, pressing Teimuraz's cause and describing their own border wars and raids. Yet in the east, the balance was shifting against Teimuraz. Kartli's aging ruler, near the end of his life, chose successors with Iranian approval, and any candidate who seemed too independent became a target. Deaths in hunting accidents were treated as convenient explanations for removals that looked like political executions. A new Georgian ruler returned from Iran with a Muslim title, bearing the Shah's confidence and the authority to reshape Kartli. In Kakhetiya, the Shah placed power under a governor who settled tens of thousands of Turkmen families on prime land, building forts to secure the newcomers. The settlement program was not just demographic, it was strategic. It aimed to change the human geography of Kakhetiya so thoroughly that a Georgian restoration would become impossible. Teimuraz travelled to Moscow himself, older and exhausted, to plead directly. The reception was polite, but ultimately disillusioning. On his return, he learned of yet another grandson's death, then endured the loss of his wife, then watched his last reliable ally in the West die as well. Grief and politics fused into a single downward spiral. When Kartli's new ruler invaded Imeretia and deposed figures there, Teimuraz was treated with formal respect, but no longer controlled events. He was escorted east as an honoured captive. At Iran's court, he was pressured to abandon his faith. Offers were made, even provocations staged on religious fast days. And when he refused, humiliation followed. He was sent to a remote place near the Caspian, took holy orders, and died far from the thrones that had consumed his life. His long struggle achieved little in statecraft, yet it left a mark in culture. In intervals of relative calm, he translated Persian verse, wrote powerful lines about martyrdom and loss, and helped revive Georgian poetry at a time when politics seemed to be killing everything else. Court entertainments and verse dialogues performed for foreign visitors planted seeds for later theatrical traditions. In that sense, the man who failed to save his kingdoms still shaped the language his people used to remember them. While he aged in exile and confinement, violence exploded again in Kakhetiya and Kartli. A brutal incident involving Turkmen settlers sparked a Highlanders uprising led by powerful dukes and church figures. Fortresses were attacked, garrisons slaughtered, and entire areas became associated with extermination and revenge. Across eastern Georgia, communal violence spread and old restraints vanished. Some Iranian officials were killed, while a few were spared for reasons that remain unclear even in later retellings. The Shah responded by appointing new governors and demanding hostages. Noble families were punished through their sons. Leaders were tortured to death by tribesmen. Guerrilla fighting continued in the highlands, sustained by clans who could endure hunger and cold longer than any garrison. A new Kartlian king, like earlier Iranian-approved rulers, tried to rule through patient patronage and a careful balance between obedience to Iran and tolerance for Georgian Christianity. His conversion was treated as a political uniform more than a personal transformation. He appointed church leaders from within his own family networks, kept the court outwardly Islamic, while allowing pork and wine to circulate quietly, and managed foreign visitors with calculated hospitality. Western musicians, foreign doctors, missionaries, and artists appeared at court, paid with goods that revealed how deeply the slave economy had penetrated elite life. Schools and language instruction expanded under missionary influence, and educated Georgians were sent abroad for training. A queen with cultural ambition sponsored editorial work on chronicles, shaping how Kartli's past would be read and remembered. This uneasy stability did not end rivalry, it merely reorganized it. Kings were forced to divorce and remarry according to Iranian preference. Children were absorbed into Persian service or taken into court life. Ambitious princes reached for Imeretia's crown, provoking Ottoman anger because treaties forbade Eastern rulers from stepping into the Western sphere. Ottoman pashas mobilized forces, protested to Iran, and used garrisons as levers to punish any move toward Georgian unification. In the West, the brief moment of relief came when Levan Dadiani died suddenly. A man who had ruled through fear and profit and left behind a society exhausted by serfdom and slave trading. His successor faced immediate challenge. Rival claimants offered hostages, returned disputed territories, and tried to buy legitimacy. Battles settled little for long. One king restored dominance for a moment, then chaos returned, pulling Guria and Mingrelia into new cycles of assassination, depositions, and foreign interference. Princes fled to Istanbul, were restored by Ottoman pashas, then murdered by local factions. No succession remained secure because every rival now understood that a crown could be taken by bribe as easily as by battle. Imeretia's own monarchy entered a period of absurd cruelty and near constant coups. A king died after a meal, and power fell into the hands of a domineering queen who treated the throne as personal property. She forced marriages, dictated documents, placed her own name above the king's, and then pushed matters into scandal and violence that shocked even a society accustomed to brutality. When her plans were rejected, she blinded the king and ruled through a puppet marriage to a man despised by the population. The nobility responded with revolt, inviting external intervention from both Mingrelia and Kartli, each of which arrived with its own ambitions. Captive kings and queens became bargaining chips, hauled from fortress to fortress. Treasuries were loaded onto wagons and carried away like war loot. Alliances formed and broke over marriages, dowries, and insults. Kartli's king invaded, seized key towns, replaced Mingrelia's ruler with a more obedient candidate, and installed his own son on Imeretia's throne, briefly creating the appearance of a reunited Georgia. Yet treaties between the empires forbade exactly that outcome, and Ottoman pressure rose immediately. The unification could not be defended without igniting a larger imperial conflict. The son was removed and redirected toward another crown elsewhere, while hostages remained trapped in Ottoman hands. The West fell back into its old pattern. Kings returning and fleeing, crowned and deposed, sometimes holding Kutaisi for months, sometimes losing it overnight. For outsiders, the most shocking feature was not just political instability, but the moral economy that fed it. Slave trading was not a side crime. It was a pillar of elite wealth. Clerics, nobles, courtiers, and even royal households participated. Peasants suffered a double burden of feudal exaction and the constant fear of being seized and sold. Some observers concluded that slavery under a great empire could be less crushing than serfdom under local lords, because at least a slave might occasionally rise, while a serf in the Western principalities had no path at all. Ottoman troops, when they did intervene, often looted with contempt, calling the region by mocking names and treating its people as uncivilized. Only Ottoman laziness and limited administrative interest prevented the West from being transformed into a fully integrated province like other conquered areas. Diplomacy with Russia became a tragic comedy. Western envoys begged for protection, but Moscow struggled to interpret a landscape where alliances shifted weekly and royal families married, divorced, and murdered with dizzying speed. One Georgian prince at the Russian court undermined rival embassies and accused them of crimes to isolate competitors. Some delegations were imprisoned in distant monasteries, their mission ending not in alliance, but in detention. Meanwhile, kings in Kutaisi survived by bribing Ottoman pashas, retreating into mountains, exchanging fortresses for hostages, and trading prisoners for money like merchants at war. Imeretia's throne changed hands repeatedly through the late 17th century. Claimants appeared with dubious bloodlines. Magnates married daughters to convenient kings, then replaced those kings with new ones when the arrangement no longer paid. A young queen was married and remarried before reaching adulthood, her marriages used as political glue for alliances between principalities. Rival factions promised the Ottomans unpaid taxes for decades in exchange for support. Ottoman armies arrived to enthrone a candidate, then withdrew as winter closed the passes, leaving the new king at the mercy of local nobles who had never intended to obey him. Cathedrals were damaged, garrisons starved behind walls, and alliances collapsed over demands for border regions. Even when a more capable ruler held Kutaisi for a time, the nobility resisted reforms that threatened their stolen lands and slave profits. Attempts to return confiscated property to its original owners provoked immediate revolt, because theft had become a foundation of wealth. Princes fled again into Ossetia and beyond, sometimes narrowly escaping capture by chieftains bribed by Iran. One king returned so many times that his reigns became a series of short episodes, separated by snow, bribes, and ambushes. He eventually abandoned the West for Russia permanently, leaving behind the same problem he had never been able to solve: a political class that considered the kingdom a market, and the crown a prize to be auctioned. By the end of the century, the West had devoured its own legitimacy. Kings were assassinated outside bedrooms. Noble hitmen waited by doors. Marriages were annulled as casually as alliances. Magnates ruled more firmly than monarchs. Meanwhile, in the East, despite episodes of vindictive violence and forced conversion, Iran's system produced longer stretches of stability, administrative continuity, and cultural patronage. The contrast was painful. The Western principalities remained useful to the Ottomans, mostly as slave reservoirs and buffer zones, while Kartli and Kakhetiya, though constrained by Iran, could still sustain courts, cities, and organized ecclesiastical centers. Teimuraz's story ended before the Western collapse reached its most farcical extremes. But the world he had fled into was already a vortex. Kutaisi gave him shelter, but it also placed him inside a political storm where every promise was temporary. Every oath was negotiable, and every crown could be bought, stolen, or torn away by force. The tragedy was not only that Teimuraz failed to regain his eastern kingdoms. The deeper tragedy was that the refuge he sought in the west was itself drowning in a cycle of violence so constant that even the most patient observer could struggle to keep track of who was king, who was hostage, and who was already dead.